Hello everyone, I'm the sleep storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. Many of you listen to these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know where you're from and what time it is as you listen. Now get cozy, take a deep breath, and let's begin.
The night had settled in, casting an eerie darkness over the village. A cold wind whispered. Through the trees, and the dense forest on the outskirts lay shrouded in an unsettling silence. Arif, a passionate photographer, had always been fascinated by abandoned places, and tonight, he had set out on a journey to explore the infamous, cursed house that no one dared to enter. The house had stood untouched for decades, its walls covered in thick layers of dust, its windows broken, and the one scranned wooden door hanging loosely on rusted hinges. The villagers whispered tales of strange shadows, eerie whispers, and people who entered but never returned. Arif, however, was a skeptic. He believed these were mere myths created to scare people away. Armed with his camera, he stepped onto the creaky porch, his heart pounding slightly, but his curiosity overpowering his fear. As he pushed open the door, a gust of stale air greeted him. The inside was just as he had expected: broken furniture, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and an eerie silence that seemed almost unnatural. He turned on his flashlight and clicked a few pictures, admiring the haunting beauty of the place. Suddenly, a strange feeling washed over him. It felt as if someone was watching him. He turned sharply, his flashlight scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. Shrugging it off, he continued deeper into the house. Each step he took echoed in the emptiness, and the air seemed to grow colder. Then he heard it, a whisper, soft, almost like the wind, yet undeniably human, his breath hitched as he turned around, his camera ready to capture whatever it was. But the hall behind him was empty. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It felt like multiple voices overlapping, murmuring words he couldn't understand. Arif swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around his camera. He knew he should leave, but something about this place pulled him in. He reached the main hall, where an old, dust-covered mirror stood against the wall. As he approached, his reflection stared back at him, his face pale under the flashlight's beam, but then his blood ran cold. The reflection moved before he did. A shadow, darker than the night itself, loomed behind him in the mirror. His breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly raised its head, hollow eyes locking onto his. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. Then the lights flickered. The air around him grew thick, suffocating. The whispering voices turned into agonized screams. Arif stumbled back, his heart hammering against his chest. He turned to flee, but as soon as he spun around, he found himself face to face with it. The shadow was no longer just in the mirror. It was standing right before him. It had no features, no eyes, no mouth, yet he could feel it staring deep into his soul. His flashlight flickered and then died, leaving him in complete darkness. The last thing he heard, before everything went silent, was a low, raspy breath right next to his ear. Then nothing. The next morning, the villagers found Arif's camera lying on the ground outside the house. The lens was cracked, the battery drained, but the last picture taken sent shivers down their spines. It was a blurry image of the main hall, but in the center of the frame stood a shadowy figure. And in the reflection of the mirror, Arif's terrified face was frozen in a silent scream. Since that day, no one ever saw him again. But at night, when the wind howls through the trees, villagers swear they can hear his whispers, trapped forever in the cursed house. The road leading to the old Ravenshade asylum was barely visible under the thick mist that clung to the ground like an eerie shroud. The air was damp, filled with the scent of decaying leaves, and the occasional howl of a distant wolf echoed in the silence. It was the kind of night that sent shivers down the spine, the kind of darkness that made even the bravest hesitate. But not Daniel's. He had always been fascinated by abandoned places, the forgotten stories trapped within there. Crumbling walls. As a journalist specializing in paranormal investigations, he had explored dozens of eerie sites, each with its own tragic history. But Ravenshade was different. The asylum had been shut down in the late 1950s after a series of gruesome patient deaths that no one could explain. Stories of experiments, ghostly apparitions, and strange occurrences had turned it into a local legend. And now Daniel stood before it, gripping his camera tightly. The towering iron gates were rusted, hanging loosely from their hinges. Beyond them, the asylum loomed in the darkness, its broken windows staring like hollow eyes. His breath misted in the cold night air as he pushed the gates open. The creaking sound echoed through the silence, making his heartbeat quicken. The moment he stepped onto the overgrown path, a strange sensation crawled up his spine. Feeling of being watched, he shook it off. It was just his mind playing tricks on him, heightened by the ominous atmosphere. The entrance doors were slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. With a deep breath, he pushed them open, stepping into the darkness. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the peeling walls. The air inside was thick with the scent of mold and something else, something metallic. Blood. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and moved forward. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with rusted wheelchairs and broken stretchers. Graffiti covered the walls, but beneath the modern markings, he could see faint, faded words written in chalk. "Help US." Daniel exhaled slowly. He had read about the asylum's past, stories of cruel experiments, of patients disappearing overnight. The whispers of agony still seemed to cling to the very walls. A sudden sound made him freeze. Footsteps. Soft, measured, coming from the corridor to his left. He turned sharply, his flashlight trembling slightly. The hallway was empty, yet the sound continued, growing closer. A shiver ran through him as he forced himself to move toward the source. He had come for a story. He wouldn't run now. The sound led him to what appeared to be the old patient records room. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, and inside, rows of rusted filing cabinets stood in eerie silence. Papers littered the floor, yellowed with age. He scanned the room, his flashlight catching something unusual, a file left open on a desk. It was labeled Patient 246. Curious, he picked it up, flipping through the pages. The patient's name had been blacked out, but the notes remained. The subject shows signs of severe paranoia, claims to see the shadow man, requests to be moved from room 309, denied. Daniel frowned. The shadow man. It sounded like one of those urban legends, an entity that haunted those who strayed too far into the asylum's depths. But this was real, a documented case. A sudden gust of air hit the back of his neck, cold and unnatural. He spun around, but the room was empty. The filing cabinet stood motionless, the papers Undisturbed, yet he could feel it. Something was here, watching. His breathing grew shallow as he took slow, careful steps out of the room. His plan had been to explore for a few hours, capture some footage, and leave. But now he wasn't so sure. The weight of unseen eyes pressed down on him, making the very air feel suffocating. He moved deeper into the asylum, his footsteps echoing through the halls. Then he saw it. Door slightly ajar, a rusted plaque above it. Room 309. His pulse quickened. The room the patient had begged to be moved from. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, the walls were covered in deep scratches, as if someone had clawed at them in desperation. The bed was overturned, the mattress torn open, and in the corner of the room something was scrawled on the wall in what looked like dried blood. "He is here." A chill wrapped around his spine. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but then he heard it. A whisper, soft, almost gentle. "Daniel." His name. His blood turned to ice. Slowly he turned toward the mirror in the corner of the room. His reflection stared back at him, pale, terrified. But there was something else. Behind him, a tall, shadowy figure loomed in the reflection, its face featureless, its elongated fingers stretching toward him. His breath caught in his throat as he spun around. Nothing. But the air felt charged, heavy with something unseen. The door slammed shut on its own, and the whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural, inhuman. He scrambled for the door handle, yanking it open. The hallway was different now. The peeling. Walls were gone, replaced with pristine white tiles. The stretchers were clean, the wheelchairs upright, and from the end of the hall, footsteps approached. A doctor in an old-fashioned white coat appeared, pushing a gurney. On it lay a man strapped. Down, his eyes wild with terror. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. It was him. The patient on the gurney was him. His own face, his own terrified expression. The doctor turned to him and smiled. "Welcome back, patient 246. Daniel opened his mouth to scream, but darkness consumed him. The next morning, the locals found his car still parked near the asylum gates, but Daniel was gone. His camera was found near room 309, the last picture showing nothing but a dark hallway. But on the audio recording, just before the feed cut out, one thing was clear. A whisper. He never leaves. The night was cold, the sky blanketed with heavy clouds that swallowed the moonlight. The wind howled through the empty streets of Blackwood, a town forgotten by time. On the outskirts stood an old Victorian house, Ravenhurst Manor, its dark silhouette looming like a specter. Against the night sky, nobody in town spoke about the house anymore. It was as if pretending it didn't exist would erase the horrors tied to it. But Ava Carter, a thrill-seeking paranormal investigator, had no such fears. She had spent years chasing ghost stories, debunking myths and exposing so-called haunted places as mere tales. But tonight, as she parked her car outside Ravenhurst, something inside her whispered that this place was different. She ignored the creeping unease and grabbed her camera, flashlight, and recorder. The gate was rusted shut, forcing her to climb over. As soon as her feet touched the ground, a cold wave of dread swept over her. The air here was wrong, heavy, thick, like stepping into a forgotten nightmares. Ava shook off the feeling and approached the front door. The wood was warped with age, the paint peeling away like dead skin. As she pushed it open, a loud creak echoed through the empty halls. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and something else, something metallic. The smell of blood. She swallowed hard and stepped inside. The grand foyer was lined with rotting furniture and cobweb-covered chandeliers. An old mirror stood in the hallway, cracked down the center. Ava pointed her flashlight at it, and for a second she thought she saw something move in the reflection. A shadow. She whipped around. Nothing. She exhaled sharply, adjusting her grip on the camera. All right, let's get this started. She turned on her recorder. This is Ava Carter. It's 11:45 p.m. and I've just entered Ravenhurst Manor. Locals say the house is cursed. Doors slam shut, whispers fill the air, and some say if you stay past midnight, you never leave. Ava smirked. Let's see if the ghosts feel like talking tonight. She moved deeper into the house. The wooden floor groaned beneath her feet, each step, kicking up clouds of dust. The place was massive, long hallways, abandoned rooms, and a spiral staircase that disappeared into darkness. She entered what looked like an old study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with rot. Tomes, a desk sat in the corner, and on top of it, a single open book. The pages were covered in scratches, words scribbled over each other in desperate errata. Writing, she leaned in, squinting at the faded ink. They are in the walls. Ava's stomach tightened. A sudden thud made her jump. She turned, scanning the room. Hello. Silence. She swallowed and backed away, moving toward the stairs. As she climbed, the air grew colder. Her breath misted in front of her, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Then, a whisper, soft, faint. Ava. Her blood ran cold. She froze mid-step, her heart hammering in her chest. Who's there? She demanded, her voice firm but shaking. The whisper came again, this time closer. Ava, why did you come? Ava spun around, flashlight shaking. The hallway behind her was empty, but the whispering continued, growing louder, layering upon itself, overlapping voices filling the air. She turned and bolted up the stairs, her pulse pounding. The hallway stretched before her, doors lining either side, all slightly ajar. She moved forward, gripping the recorder tighter. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence. Then, one of the doors slammed shut. Ava yelped, stumbling back. A loud scraping sound filled the hall, like something crawling inside the walls. Then came the knocking. A slow, methodical knock, knock, knock from inside the walls. Her breathing was shallow, her body frozen. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself forward, towards the door that had slammed shut. She reached out, hand trembling, and pushed it open. Inside was a bedroom untouched by time. A large canopy bed, a rocking chair in the corner, and a dusty old portrait hanging above the fireplace. A young girl, black eyes, smiling. Ava's skin prickled with unease. Then something moved in the reflection of the mirror across the room. She turned sharply, raising her flashlight. A figure stood in the mirror. Not a reflection, an actual figure standing inside the mirror. A woman pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that leaked darkness. Her dress was old, tattered. Her lips twisted into a grin as she stepped forward. Ava stumbled back. The woman raised her hand and pressed it against the glass. Ava's breath hitched as the woman mimicked her movements, pressing her hand against the mirror from the inside. Then, the glass cracked. Thin spiderweb fractures spread from the woman's hand, and a low, guttural laugh filled the air. Ava ran. She bolted down the hallway, her footsteps thundering against the wooden floor. The house came alive around her, doors slamming, whispers turning to screams, the walls bulging as if something was inside them. She reached the stairs, taking them two at a time, her lungs burning. The front door was open, a miracle. She sprinted toward it, but as she crossed the threshold, a cold hand grabbed her ankle. She crashed onto the floor, twisting to see what had grabbed her. The woman, no longer in the mirror, here with her. Her blackened, hollow eyes bore into Ava's soul as she crawled forward, her fingers digging into the wooden floor. "Oh, stay!" Ava screamed, kicking free, and scrambled outside. The moment she crossed the gate, the house fell silent. No screams, no whispers, just stillness. She collapsed by her car, chest heaving. Her recorder had fallen during the escape still, clutched in her shaking hand. She hit play, desperate to know if any of it was real. At first, only silence. Then, a whisper, soft, familiar. "See you soon, Ava." The recorder shut off. She never went back to Ravenhurst. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she would wake up to soft knocking on her bedroom. Wald, knock, 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 and a voice that whispered, ever so softly, "Let me in." The train station was nearly deserted, save for a few scattered passengers waiting for the last train of the night. The overhead lights flickered occasionally, casting eerie shadows across the cold concrete platform. The air smelled of rust, old metal, and something else, something faintly rotten. Ethan checked his watch. 11:57 p.m. The train was late. He shifted his weight, rubbing his arms to fight off the creeping chill. The night was unusually cold for late autumn, and the station felt unnaturally quiet. The only sound was the rhythmic dripping of water from a leaky pipe nearby. A soft shuffle caught his attention. He turned his head and saw a man standing near the far end of the platform, dressed in an old suit. His back turned, the man stood completely still, facing the tracks. Something about him felt off. Ethan frowned. Had he been there before? He hadn't noticed him when he arrived. Shrugging off the unease, he pulled out his phone. No signal, typical. A gust of wind blew through the station, carrying with it a faint whisper. Ethan stiffened. It almost sounded like his name. He glanced around, but the few other passengers sat silently, lost in their own worlds. He shook his head. Maybe he was just tired. Then, a deep rumbling sound echoed through the tunnel. The train was arriving. Ethan sighed in relief as the old, rickety train emerged from the darkness. It looked older than he expected, almost like it belonged to another era with faded paint and worn out carriages. The train screeched to a halt, doors sliding open with a mechanical hiss. The passengers around him began boarding, but Ethan hesitated. Something didn't feel right. A strange pressure weighed on his chest, a voice in the back of his mind screaming at him to turn around and leave. But that was ridiculous. It was just a train. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting unsettling shadows. The air smelled musty, thick with the scent of old leather and something metallic. Blood. Ethan shook off the thought and moved to find a seat. The other passengers sat in eerie silence, their faces hidden in the dim light. Something about them seemed off. They sat too still, their heads bowed, their breathing barely audible. Ethan swallowed hard and sat near the window, gripping his phone. Still no signal. The train lurched forward, the old metal groaning as it sped into the night. Outside, the landscape wasn't moving. Ethan frowned. That didn't make sense. The train was moving, but the view outside remained. The same, a dark, endless tunnel stretching infinitely in both directions. His pulse quickened. He turned his head, scanning the train car. Something was wrong. The passengers weren't moving. Not even the slightest breath. Not even a single blink. His mouth went dry as a terrible realization hit him. They weren't passengers. They were corpses. A sudden shift made him whip his head around. The man in the old suit now sat directly across from him. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. He hadn't seen him bored, hadn't seen him move. The man's face was pale, almost gray, with deep, sunken eyes that stared directly at him. His lips curved into a slow, unnatural smile. Ethan's breath hitched. "Who are you?" he managed to whisper. The man's smile widened, too wide. "You don't belong here." His voice was raspy, like dry leaves scraping against stone. Ethan's skin crawled. "What are you talking about?" The man tilted his head. "You boarded the wrong train." The lights flickered violently. For a brief moment, Ethan saw them. The passengers weren't passengers at all. Their faces were twisted in agony, their mouths stretched in silent screams. Their hands clawed at their seats, their bodies rotting where they sat. A surge of panic shot through him. He leapt to his feet, heart pounding. The man in the suit simply watched. "You need to get off," he said, voice disturbingly calm, "before the conductor comes." Ethan's blood ran cold. "Who?" Then, a loud metallic clang echoed through the train. The temperature dropped instantly. A deep, guttural breathing filled the air. Ethan turned slowly, his body paralyzed with fear. At the far end of the train, a tall figure emerged from the shadows. The conductor. Its body was too long, draped in a tattered railway uniform. Its face was featureless, just black void stretching across its head. It moved slowly, methodically, dragging something heavy. And wet behind it. The air grew thick with the stench of rot. Ethan staggered back, every instinct screaming at him to run. The man in the suit stood, his expression unreadable. "This is your last stop." Ethan turned and bolted toward the exit doors, slamming his fists against them. "Let me out." The train kept moving. The conductor's steps grew louder, the wet dragging sound getting closer. Desperate, Ethan turned to the suited man. "Help me." The man's expression finally changed. "Pity. You never should have boarded," he murmured. Then, the lights cut out. Ethan woke up to the sound of rain. His eyes snapped open. He was outside, lying on the empty train platform. The night was dark. The air thick with the scent of damp earth. The train was gone. He scrambled to his feet, his heart still racing. Had it been a dream? His phone vibrated. A text message. 11:57 p.m., last train home. You got off just in time. His hands trembled. His breath came in short gasps. He turned toward the tracks. Far in the distance, just beyond the tunnel's edge, he saw it. The train, still moving, still carrying its passengers. And at the very back, watching him through the window, the man in the old suit, smiling. The train disappeared into the darkness, its final destination unknown. And Ethan knew, deep in his bones, some passengers never got off. It was a cold, moonless night, and Asen walked down the deserted road with an uneasy feeling. Gnawing at his heart, he was passing through the old part of the village, a place whispered to be. Cursed, haunted by a presence that no one dared to name, but Asen never believed in such. Story, he just wanted to reach his friend's house as soon as possible. The wind howled through the trees, their rustling leaves sounding like hushed voices in the darkness. Suddenly, he felt a hand on his shoulder. His breath hitched and he spun around, but there was no one there. A chill ran down his spine. Shaking his head, he convinced himself it was just his imagination and continued walking. But the moment he turned forward, his heart nearly stopped. A tall, shadowy figure stood in the middle of the road, its face obscured by darkness. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him. Asen's throat went dry. "Who's there?" he managed to croak. Silence. Then, in a voice that barely seemed human, the figure whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Asen stumbled back, his legs trembling. He turned to run, but the road behind him was no longer empty. Shadows moved in the darkness, creeping toward him like living nightmares. He bolted, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. But no matter how fast he ran, the whispers followed, soft, chilling, and human. The air turned heavy, suffocating him. Suddenly he tripped over something and fell face first into the dirt. As he pushed himself up, he saw what had caused him to fall. A gravestone, half buried and covered in moss. His blood turned to ice when he read the name engraved on it. It was his own. A scream tore through the night, but the wind carried it away, leaving behind only silence. The shadows closed in, and Asen's world faded into darkness. By morning, the road was empty again. No one ever saw Asen again, just like the others. Before him, the storm had rolled in fast. Thick black clouds swallowed the moonlight and heavy rain lashed against the car windshield as Mia and Daniel drove down the isolated country road. The GPS had failed miles ago, leaving them navigating in the dark with nothing but instinct and the dim glow of their headlights. Mia gripped the map in her lap, frustration growing with each passing mile. "We should have reached the motel by now," she muttered. Daniel sighed, knuckles tightening on the wheel. "I don't understand. The road signs do match anything on the map. It's like we're going in circles." The storm intensified. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the trees lining the road swayed violently. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the landscape for a split second, revealing something up ahead, a house. A massive Victorian mansion, standing alone at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by an iron fence that had long since rusted. Mia leaned forward, staring at it. That wasn't on the map either. Daniel slowed the car. Maybe someone there can give us directions. Mia hesitated. Everything about the house felt wrong, the way it stood there untouched by time, as if waiting for someone to arrive. The windows were dark, lifeless, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from within. Still, they had no choice. The rain was relentless and they were lost. They pulled up to the gate, stepping out into the storm. The cold rain soaked them instantly, and Mia shivered as Daniel pushed open the creaking iron gate. The gravel crunched beneath their feet as they approached the front door, towering and ancient, with a brass knocker shaped like a twisting serpent. Daniel lifted the knocker and let it fall. The sound echoed unnaturally, as if swallowed by the house itself. The silence followed. Then the door creaked open on its own. Mia's stomach twisted. We shouldn't go in. Daniel, ever the skeptic, shrugged. It's just old, probably the wind. With a deep breath, they stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick with dust and the scent of something long forgotten. The grand foyer stretched before them, lined with faded wallpaper and antique furniture. A massive chandelier, covered in cobwebs, hung above, barely swaying as if disturbed by an unseen breeze. Then the door slammed shut behind them. Mia spun around, heart pounding. That was not the wind. Daniel jiggled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Maybe it jammed. A soft whisper echoed from the second floor. Mia grabbed his arm. Did you hear that? Daniel nodded slowly, his confidence faltering. Hello, he called out. No answer. A staircase wound upward into darkness. The walls were lined with portraits, each one depicting an unknown figure with hollow, dark eyes. Mia's skin prickled as she swore she saw something shift in one of the paintings. Then came the footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming from the upper floor. Someone's up there, Mia whispered. Daniel's jaw tightened. Maybe they can help us. They moved toward the stairs, each step creaking beneath them. The air grew colder, thick with an unshakable sense of being watched. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched ahead, lined with closed doors. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by an unbearable silence. Mia's breath hitched as she noticed something strange. The floor was covered in dust, yet there were no footprints. Daniel reached for the nearest door and pushed it open. Inside was a bedroom untouched by time, a grand four-poster bed, a rocking chair in the corner, and a massive mirror covering the far wall. Then a whisper, soft, right behind Mia's ear. Leave. Mia spun around, but no one was there. She turned to Daniel, her face pale. We need to go now. Daniel frowned, but the mirror cracked. A thin, jagged line splintered across the glass, and a shadow moved inside it. Mia grabbed his hand. Run. They bolted out of the room, the doors along the hallway slamming shut one by one as they passed. The house groaned, as if waking from a deep slumber. Then came the laughter, low, mocking all around them. They flew down the stairs, but the front door was gone. Mia's scream caught in her throat. Where the door had been was now just a solid wall, as if no exit had ever existed. The chandelier above them swayed violently, dust raining down. The walls shifted, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal something beneath, claw marks. Then the whispering returned, louder, closer. Mia turned and her breath froze in her chest. A figure stood at the top of the stairs. Tall, hollow eyes, a twisted grin that stretched too wide. It raised a hand, beckoning. Daniel grabbed her wrist. Basement. They ran toward a door at the back of the house, throwing it open and stumbling down the pitch-black staircase. The air was wet, heavy with decay. Their breaths came in ragged gasps. As they reached the bottom, then a light flickered on. A single bare bulb illuminated the space. Chains hung from the ceiling. Rusted tools covered a stained workbench. And in the center of the room stood a single wooden chair. Someone sat in it. Mia choked on a scream. It was her. A perfect copy of herself, sitting motionless, eyes staring straight ahead. Her reflection blinked. The bulb shattered. Darkness swallowed them whole. Mia felt something cold and bony wrap around her wrist. A voice close to her ear. You never should have come here. The last thing she heard before the world vanished was Daniel's scream. Then silence. The next morning, the storm had cleared. The sun shone brightly over the empty field where the house had once stood. No sign of Mia. No sign of Daniel. Only the rusted iron gate, swinging slowly in the wind. The village of Norabad had always been peaceful until the disappearances began. It started with a young boy who never returned home after dusk. Then an old man vanished while on his way to the mosque. Soon, whispers of something unnatural lurking in the dark spread through the village. Ian, a young journalist from the city, arrived in Norabad to investigate. He had always been skeptical of supernatural tales, believing them to be mere exaggerations. The village elders warned him not to wander alone at night, but he dismissed their fears as superstition. One evening, despite the villagers' warnings, Ian decided to explore the outskirts. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and purple. A chilling breeze swept through the trees as he ventured deeper into the forest, where most of the disappearances had occurred. As he walked, he felt an unsettling silence settle over the area. There were no chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just a void of sound that made his skin crawl. Suddenly, he heard it. Whisper, go back. He spun around, his flashlight shaking in his hand. There was no one there. Ian swallowed, hard trying to steady his nerves. Who's there? He called out, but only silence replied. Determined to uncover the truth, he pushed forward. His footsteps crunched against the dry leaves, the sound unnaturally loud in the eerie stillness. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a shadow just beyond the trees. His heart pounded as he approached the spot where he had seen it, but there was nothing, only darkness stretching between the trees. A sudden gust of wind howled through the branches, and that's when he saw them. Eyes glowing in the darkness. His breath hitched as he realized they were not human. The eyes were too large, too hollow, filled with an unnatural hunger. A guttural growl echoed through the air, and before Ian could react, a force slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. He scrambled to his feet, his flashlight flickering wildly. The shadows around him seemed to move, shifting and writhing like living entities. A cold hand brushed against his neck, and a whisper slithered into his ear. Leave before it takes you too. Ian didn't need another warning. He turned and ran, branches tearing at his clothes as he stumbled through the forest. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more insistent. He could feel the presence closing in, the air thick with something malevolent. By the time he reached the village, he was gasping for breath. The villagers looked at him with knowing eyes. "You saw it, didn't you?" an old woman asked. Ian nodded, unable to speak. The village elder stepped forward. "It is the Watcher of the Dark. It takes those who do not heed." The warnings. Ian left Norabad the next morning, but the whispers never left him. Even in the city, in the safety of his apartment, he could hear them in the dead of night. Go back. But he never did. 1 month later, he disappeared, just like the others. And Norabad remained silent, waiting for the next visitor who refused to believe. The village of Black Hollow had always been surrounded by dark legends. The old well, standing at the edge of the abandoned woods, was at the center of most of them. People whispered that something lived down there, something that called to those who strayed too close. For years, the well had remained sealed shut, covered with rusted iron bars and thick chains. The elders warned the villagers never to go near it, never to listen to the whispers that sometimes rose from the depths on quiet nights. But Lena didn't believe in old stories. She was new to the village, a city girl who had moved here for a quieter life. The well, to her, was just a hole in the ground, a relic of old superstition. So when she walked past it that evening and heard the whisper, she stopped. "Help me." Lena froze. The voice was soft, fragile, a child's voice. She stepped closer, peering through the gaps in the rusted bars. The well was deep, nothing but darkness below. "Hello," she called. Silence. Then a scrape. A slow, deliberate sound, as if something was moving below. Lena's heart pounded. Is someone down there? Another whisper, closer this time. "I'm so cold." Goosebumps prickled her skin. It had to be a prank. Someone was messing with her. But then she heard it, the sound of breathing. Not from below. From right behind her. Lena whirled around. Nothing. Her breath hitched. The wind had stopped. The trees didn't move. The air was thick, suffocating. The village, once visible in the distance, now seemed impossibly far away. And then a hand shot through the bars. Pale, too long, too thin. Fingers stretched toward her, grasping the air. Lena screamed and stumbled back, heart hammering. The whisper came again, but now it wasn't soft. It was hungry. "Let me out." Lena ran. She didn't stop until she reached her cottage, slamming the door behind her. Her lungs burned, her mind racing. But the worst part, as she stood in the darkness of her house, heart still pounding, she heard it. The breathing, right outside her door. A slow, shallow exhale. Then knocking. Lena clamped a hand over her mouth, forcing herself not to scream. The knocks were slow, methodical. 1, 2, 3. And then a whisper. "You saw me." Tears blurred her vision. She backed away from the door, her entire body trembling. Then the knocking stopped. The silence stretched on. But something felt wrong. The room was too quiet. The air was too still. It was as if the world was holding its breath. And then she realized. She could still hear the breathing. It was inside the house. Lena turned, her pulse pounding in her ears. The last thing she saw was a pair of hollow, black eyes staring at her from the darkness. Then, nothing. The next morning, the villagers found her cottage door wide open. Lena was gone. The only thing left was the well, its chains broken, the bars bent outward. And on stormy nights, if you passed by the well, you might hear a whisper rising from the depths. "I'm so cold." The night was thick with fog as Daniel drove up the winding road leading to Blackwood Manor, an ancient abandoned estate that loomed over the small town of Ravenshade. The house had been empty for nearly a century, its history shrouded in tragedy and ghostly rumors. Daniel, historian with a fascination for the paranormal, had come to document its secrets. The town's people had warned him. No one stays there overnight and returns the same, an old shopkeeper had muttered when Daniel purchased supplies, but he had laughed it off. As he approached, the towering structure emerged from the mist, its Gothic architecture. Broken windows and ivy-covered walls exuding an air of malevolence. He parked his car outside and grabbed his backpack, stepping onto the overgrown path leading to the entrance. The massive wooden doors groaned as he pushed them open, revealing a vast, dust-covered foyer. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of rot and decay. The grand chandelier hung precariously, its crystals coated in cobwebs. A grand staircase twisted upward into darkness. Daniel set up his camera, clicking pictures of the decayed beauty around him. But something was off. Despite the windows being shattered, there was no breeze. The silence wasn't just stillness, it was suffocating, unnatural, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Exploring deeper, Daniel entered what appeared to be the study. Shelves lined with dusty, unread books stood tall, and an old fireplace lay cold and unused. As he ran his fingers along an ornate desk, he felt a sudden chill creep up his spine. Then he heard it. A whisper, low, unintelligible, but undeniably real. He spun around, flashlight trembling in his grip. The room was empty. The house had been abandoned for decades. There shouldn't have been anyone here. His heartbeat thundered as he turned back to the desk and froze. The thick layer of dust had been disturbed. Words were being carved into the wood as if by an invisible hand. "You should not be here." Daniel staggered back, his breath ragged. His rational mind screamed that it was a prank, but deep down he knew he was not alone. Suddenly the door creaked open by itself. A shadow flickered in the dim light of the hallway. It wasn't just movement, it was something watching him. Deciding to capture proof, Daniel set up his camera in the ballroom, once a place of grand celebrations, now a desolate ruin. As he adjusted the lens, a strange sound echoed through the room. Soft, a whisper, then a giggle, high-pitched, childlike. He turned, his flashlight revealing the cracked mirrors along the walls. The reflections were warped, stretched, but something else was there. A figure. A young girl in a tattered white dress stood at the center of the ballroom. Her eyes were hollow, her skin unnaturally pale. Daniel's breath caught, a ghost. She tilted her head and spoke. "You need to leave before he wakes up." Daniel took a cautious step forward. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Her lips quivered. "The one who sleeps below." The floor trembled. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from beneath. The girl's eyes widened. "It's too late." A loud crash shook the house. Daniel stumbled as the floor beneath him cracked, revealing. Something moving underneath. A monstrous, clawed hand shot up from the ground. Screams echoed in his ears, not just his own, but dozens of voices, as if trapped souls were. Crying out, the girl had vanished. The shadows coiled around him, suffocating, pulling him. Downed, Daniel fought, kicking and thrashing, but the darkness was relentless. The last thing he saw, before everything went black, was a pair of red, glowing eyes staring at him from the abyss. Days later, the town sheriff received a report of a car abandoned outside Blackwood Manor. Upon investigation, they found Daniel's belongings scattered inside the house, his camera still. Recording. The footage showed Daniel staring at something unseen, before suddenly screaming and vanishing from sight. His body was never found. And yet some nights, villagers swore they could hear his voice, whispering from the manor. Broken windows, begging for help. But no one ever dared to enter. The road stretched endlessly before Rihan, surrounded by a dense, suffocating forest. Map showed that he should have reached the main highway an hour ago, yet he kept driving in. Circles, his phone had lost signal and the fuel gauge was dropping dangerously low. The only sign of civilization ahead was a dirt path leading into the trees. With no other option, he turned. Onto it, hopping to find a village or at least someone who could help. The path wound deeper into the forest until the trees suddenly parted, revealing a forgotten village. The houses were old, their walls covered in vines, and the air felt unnaturally heavy. There were no people in sight, but the doors of the houses stood ajar, as if waiting for someone to step inside. A strange uneasiness settled in Rihan's chest, but desperation pushed him forward. He parked the car in the center of the village and stepped out. The silence was overwhelming. No birds, no wind, nothing. As he walked toward the nearest house, he noticed something strange. There were no signs of life, yet the village didn't seem abandoned. They were fresh. Footprints in the dirt, and a table inside one house was set with steaming food, as if someone had just left. Rihan called out, but his voice echoed unanswered. His footsteps felt too loud against the silence. A creaking sound made him turn sharply. A wooden swing in front of a house swayed back and forth, even though there was no wind. He swallowed hard and decided to check. Inside, the moment he stepped through the door, an icy chill ran down his spine. The furniture was covered in dust, and cobwebs hung in the corners, yet the air smelled of burning candles. He took a cautious step forward, and a sudden whisper brushed past his ear. "You shouldn't have come." Rihan spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one. He staggered back and bumped into something soft. His breath caught in his throat as he turned slowly. An old woman stood behind him, her face pale and eyes hollow. "You must leave before night falls," she murmured. Rihan stammered, "Who are you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted a trembling finger and pointed at the far end of the village. "If you stay, they will take you too." A deep dread settled in his stomach. "Who?" Before she could reply, a low humming sound filled the air. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The old woman's face twisted in terror. "They're awake," she whispered before, vanishing like mist before his eyes. Rihan stumbled backward, breath shallow. The houses, once still and lifeless, came alive. Doors creaked open wider. The swing rocked violently. The footprints in the dirt multiplied as if unseen feet were moving all around him. A shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. He turned just in time to see something scuttle on. All fours into a nearby house. The humming grew louder, merging into an eerie chant. The village was waking up. Rihan bolted toward his car, but the vehicle wasn't where he left it. Panic surged through him. As he realized the village had changed, the path he entered from was gone. The trees had shifted, enclosing the village like a prison. The humming turned into whispers, many voices speaking at once their words. Indistinguishable yet terrifying. Shadows slithered from the houses, crawling toward him. Some had human forms. Others were twisted, grotesque things with elongated limbs and hollow faces. He ran blindly, ducking into an alley between two houses. His pulse hammered in his ears as he pressed against the cold wall, trying to control his ragged breathing. The shadows moved past. Him searching, one of them stopped. Its head snapped toward him at an unnatural angle. Rihan clenched his jaw to keep from screaming. It moved closer. Rihan shut his eyes, heart pounding. The whispering voices swirled around him, growing louder, until they became a deafening scream. Then silence. He opened his eyes. The village was empty again. The shadows had vanished. The air was still. Trembling, Rihan turned a corner and his breath caught in his throat. His car was back, but something was wrong. The windows were fogged from the inside. A figure sat in the driver. Asita. Summoning what little courage he had left, he stepped closer. The figure's head slowly turned. Toward him, it was him. His own reflection stared back, eyes hollow and filled with something dark. Its lips twisted into a smile as it lifted a hand and beckoned him forward. Rihan took a step back. The copy of him inside the car moved forward. It began to push. Against the windshield, the glass warping as if it were liquid. Its fingers stretched unnaturally, long pressing against the glass. A single word formed on its lips. Stay. Rihan turned and ran. He didn't care where, he just needed to escape. The village blurred. Around him, twisting, shifting. The trees loomed closer, their branches reaching for him like skeletal hands. His legs burned, but he kept running until the ground disappeared beneath him. He was falling into darkness. And then Rihan woke up. He was in his apartment, drenched in sweat, heart hammering. The morning sun streamed through the windows. It was just a nightmare. Or so he thought. As he sat up, something crunched beneath his fingers. He looked down. Dirt, dry, cracked dirt, the same kind from the village. His blood ran cold. Slowly, he turned his head toward the corner of the room. His suitcase sat there, half unpacked from his last trip. The zipper was slightly open. Something was moving inside. A whisper slithered through the air, the same voice from the village. The rain poured relentlessly as Hamza drove down the deserted highway, his car slicing through the darkness like a lone survivor in an abyss. The clock on the dashboard read 2:47 a.m. The road stretched ahead, slick with rain, the wipers struggling to keep up with the storm. Distant sound of thunder rumbled in the sky, echoing through the emptiness around him. Hamza had been driving for hours, trying to reach his hometown before dawn. His mother had fallen ill, and he had left the city in a hurry. The highway was lonely, not a single vehicle in sight. The only company he had was the occasional flash of lightning and the rhythmic hum of his car's engine. Then he saw her. A lone figure stood at the side of the road, barely illuminated by the headlights. A woman, drenched in the rain, her long black hair sticking to her pale face. She wore a white shalwar, camis completely soaked, her bare feet visible in the mud. She stood still, too still, as if she had been waiting for him. Hamza's foot hesitated on the accelerator. Every instinct told him to drive past her. Something about the way she stood, her head slightly tilted downward, sent a cold shiver down his spine. But then he thought of his mother. What if she were stranded in the middle of nowhere, in need of help? He pulled over. The rain drummed against the roof as he leaned across and opened the passenger door. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice almost drowned by the storm. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a whisper that barely reached him, she replied, "Home." Her voice was hollow, almost lifeless, but Hamza ignored the unease creeping up his neck. He nodded and gestured for her to get in. She moved slowly, deliberately, and slid into the seat. Without a sound, as he merged back onto the road, he couldn't help but glance at her from the corner of his eye. She sat unnaturally still, her hands folded in her lap, her face hidden by her wet hair. The car felt colder than before. The air carried a damp, earthy scent, like freshly turned soil after rain. For a while, silence stretched between them. Then she spoke. "You shouldn't have stopped." Hamza's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. The highway seemed to stretch endlessly, the rain never letting up. Hamza tried to shake off the discomfort. Maybe she was just in shock. Maybe something terrible had happened to her. He cleared his throat. "Where is your home?" She turned her head slightly, her face still obscured. "Not far now." A chill spread through his body. He hadn't told her where he was going, yet she seemed certain of the destination. Hamza forced himself to focus on the road. The rain blurred the windshield, the wipers, struggling to clear it. The headlights illuminated the road ahead. And for a brief moment, he saw her standing by the roadside again. His breath caught in his throat. He snapped his head toward the passenger seat. She was still sitting there, but when he looked back at the road, the figure was gone. His pulse pounded. It must have been a trick of the light, the storm playing with his mind. The woman beside him suddenly shifted. He could hear the faint rustling of wet fabric. "Do you know," she whispered, "why the dead never speak?" Hamza felt ice crawl up his spine. He didn't respond. She turned her head fully toward him now. He could feel her eyes on him even though he did dare to look, because the living never listen. A hand, ice-cold, damp, inhuman, gripped his wrist. Hamza swerved the car violently, tires skidding on the slick road. The vehicle spun out of control, sliding off the highway and plunging into a ditch. The impact sent a violent jolt through his body, and for a moment, everything went black. When he woke up, the rain had stopped. The car sat half buried in mud. His head throbbed, his hands trembling as he unbuckled himself. He turned to the passenger seat. It was empty. The door was still shut. No footprints in the mud outside. No sign that anyone had ever been there. But the seat was wet, as if someone had been sitting there moments ago. A distant whisper echoed through the silent night. "You shouldn't have stopped." And somewhere just beyond the trees, a shadow watched him. The night was thick with fog as Noah Carter drove down the deserted road that cut through Ashwood Forest. The headlights of his old sedan barely pierced the swirling mist ahead, and Every tree lining the road stood like a twisted, skeletal figure looming in the darkness. The GPS had stopped working miles ago, leaving him with nothing but an old, fatting map and the hope that he was still heading toward the nearest town. Noah had been on the road for hours, exhausted and eager to find a place to rest. The storm earlier that evening had left the road slick with rain, and the eerie silence that followed felt unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the road. Noah's heart lurched. His foot hovered over the brake, but something in his gut screamed not to stop. The figure was barely visible in the thick fog, standing unnaturally still, its features obscured. As his car approached, the headlights illuminated it for only a second. A tall, pale figure with hollow eyes staring directly at him. Then it was gone. Noah's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Had he imagined it? Was it just a trick of the fog? He didn't stop to check. His fingers tightened around the wheel as he sped up, trying to shake the creeping feeling crawling up his spine. The road stretched ahead, winding through the endless trees, but the further he drove, the thicker the fog became. The mist wrapped around the car like a living thing, muffling every sound. Then his headlights caught movement again. This time there were more figures, standing in the mist, watching. Noah's heart pounded against his ribs. He couldn't make out their faces, but their motionless stance, the way they simply stood there, sent a deep, primal fear through him. Then, in his rearview mirror, he saw one standing directly behind his car. He slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched as the car lurched forward. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. He didn't look back. The fog closed in. The road twisted and turned, but Noah kept going, desperate to escape whatever was out. There, the minutes stretched on, but no matter how far he drove, the road never seemed to end. Then his headlights illuminated something up ahead. A sign. Welcome to Ashwood Hollow. Noah's blood ran cold. He had been driving for hours. How was he still at the entrance of the town? His hands shook as he slowed the car, his mind racing for an explanation. Maybe he had turned around. Maybe he had missed a turn in the fog. Then he saw them again. Lining the road, more of them. Figures standing perfectly still, their hollow eyes locked onto him. Noah's breathing grew shallow. His instincts screamed at him to turn the car around, to drive in the opposite direction, but a deep, unshakable dread settled in his chest. Because now they were closer. They hadn't moved. Not that he had seen, but they were closer. His shaking hand reached for the gear shift, ready to reverse, when the radio crackled to life. A voice, distorted, hollow. You shouldn't have come. Noah's blood turned to ice. The car engine died. Darkness swallowed everything. The fog thickened, pressing against the windows like an unseen force. Noah's pulse pounded in his ears as he desperately turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. The figures outside didn't move, yet the air felt charged as if something was waiting. Then his phone buzzed. A text message. Unknown number. Don't look away. His breath hitched. He turned his eyes to the windshield. One of the figures now stood directly in front of his car. It was staring at him. Noah's hands trembled. He wanted to look away, wanted to shut his eyes, but the message, "Don't look away." His pulse thundered in his ears. Then the figure smiled. The movement was slow, unnatural, stretching its face in an impossibly wide grin. Noah's body screamed at him to run, but his limbs were frozen, trapped in an icy grip of fear. Then his car door unlocked. The click was deafening in the silence. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He didn't move. Then came the knocking. Soft, deliberate, right next to his ear. His body went rigid. The fog shifted. A whisper slithered through the air. "Let me in." Noah snapped his eyes shut. The figures outside moved. He didn't see them move, but he could feel them getting closer. The air in the car grew colder. The scent of damp earth filling his nose. Another knock. And another's. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices. "Let me in. Let us in." Noah clamped his hands over his ears. He squeezed his eyes shut tighter. Then silence. The air shifted. The cold vanished. When he finally dared to open his eyes, the fog was gone. The road was empty. His car engine hummed quietly, as if it had never stopped. His hands were still shaking as he gripped the wheel, forcing himself to breathe. Slowly, he turned the key again. The engine roared to life. His heart pounded as he pressed the gas, this time not stopping for anything. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. Not once. Not until he had left the forest behind. Hours later, when he finally reached a gas station on the outskirts of town, he stumbled out of the car, his hands still trembling. The attendant behind the counter gave him a strange look. "You all right, man?" Noah barely nodded, running a shaking hand through his hair. Then he froze. The glass door of the gas station reflected the parking lot behind him. And in the reflection, standing just behind his car, a figure staring at him. The last thing Noah heard before the glass shattered was a whisper. "You looked away." The house stood at the end of the lonely road, half buried in fog, its windows dark and hollow. Like the eyes of something long dead, it had been abandoned for decades, yet every night a single light flickered in the upstairs window. I had always been drawn to it. Ever since I was a child, I felt the house watching me, calling me. In a way I couldn't explain, the adults in town warned me never to go near it. That house doesn't want visitors, they said. People who enter don't come back the same. But when I returned to my hometown after years away, I found myself standing before its rusted gate, staring up at the towering structure. It felt as if something had been waiting for me. The night air was heavy, suffocating, yet I pushed the gate open and stepped onto the overgrown path. The front door was already ajar. Inside, the house was silent, yet the silence felt alive, like it was listening. The furniture was covered in dust, the wallpaper peeling, and the wooden floor groaned beneath my steps. The scent of decay and something else, something old and familiar, filled my lungs. As I moved deeper inside, a whisper brushed past my ear. "You came back." I froze, my breath hitched in my throat. The voice was soft, almost gentle, yet it sent a chill down my spine. I turned sharply, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. There was no one. A sudden gust of wind, slammed the front door shut behind me. The air shifted. The house felt different now, like I was no longer alone. I forced myself forward, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The upstairs bedroom had always been the source of the flickering light. If I could find the reason behind it, maybe I could finally understand why this house had always felt like it belonged to me. As I climbed the staircase, the wood groaned underneath someone else's weight, yet I was alone. At the top, the hallway stretched ahead, swallowed by shadows. The last door on the right stood slightly open, light spilled from within. I stepped inside. The room was just as I remembered it. The walls were covered in faded floral wallpaper. Rocking chair sat by the window, and a dusty bed lay untouched. A single candle flickered on the nightstand. Then I saw it. The mirrors. It stood tall against the far wall, its surface fogged and cracked. My reflection stared back at me. Yet something was wrong. The eyes looking at me weren't mine. I took a step closer. The reflection didn't move. A whisper slithered through the room. "You left me here." My blood ran cold. The voice, it was mine. The figure in the mirror tilted its head, a slow, unnatural movement. "You forgot who you are." The candle flickered violently, and a gust of air rushed through the room. The reflection stepped forward, yet I hadn't moved. The glass shattered. Darkness swallowed the room. I felt something wrap around my wrist, cold fingers pulling me forward. A rush of memories hit me all at once. I had been here before. Not just once, not just as a child. I had always been here. This was my home, and I had never really left. The road ahead was swallowed by thick fog, stretching endlessly into the unknown. Adil drove, cautiously, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. The highway was supposed to be a shortcut to his destination, but with no other cars in sight and his phone's signal lost miles ago, he felt completely alone. The radio crackled with static before dying completely. Silence filled the car, except for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the windshield. He sighed, glancing at the fuel gauge, half empty. He needed to reach the next town before midnight. Then he saw him. A lone figure stood at the side of the road, barely visible through the mist. He wore a black coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He raised a single hand, not waving but signaling Adil to stop. Something in his gut twisted. He knew he shouldn't stop. But his hands acted on their own, easing the car to a halt. The man didn't move. He simply stood there as if waiting. Adil rolled down the window slightly. "Do you need a ride?" The man lifted his head slightly. His face was still hidden in shadow, but his voice was smooth, almost too calm. "It's dangerous to drive alone on this road." Adil swallowed. I'm just passing through, trying to reach the next town." The man stepped forward, but his movements were strange, almost unnatural, as if he did quite belong to the world around him. "Then let me keep you company," he said. Adil hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to drive away, but before he could react, the passenger door swung open on its own. The man slid inside, closing the door gently behind him. Adil's throat went dry. "You, live around here?" The man chuckled, a hollow, distant sound. "I used to." The air inside the car grew heavy. The temperature dropped. Adil's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he pulled back onto the road. His unease grew. With every mile, the silence stretching painfully between them. Then the man spoke again. "Tell me, Adil." Adil's heart nearly stopped. He had never told him his name. "Do you believe in ghosts?" A chill crawled down his spine. His breath came shallow, his fingers trembling slightly. I do." "No." The man chuckled again. The fog outside thickened. The headlights barely pierced through it, and the road ahead seemed to shift, almost like it was changing beneath them. Adil glanced at his passenger from the corner of his eye. The man was grinning. "You should," he whispered. And then the car jerked violently, skidding off the road. Adil's head slammed against the steering wheel as everything spun into darkness. When he woke up, he was still inside the car, but the passenger seat was empty. The door was open, swinging slightly in the wind. Outside, the fog had cleared. The road was visible again. His heart pounded. He reached for his phone, still no signal. His hands shook as he grabbed the door handle, stepping out onto the cold asphalt. That's when he noticed it. A single black coat lay discarded on the ground, soaked in rain. And next to it, a gravestone. His breath hitched as he stepped closer, the name carved into the stone sending ice through his veins. It was his own. The date of death tonight. A low chuckle echoed from the fog. "You should have kept driving, Adil." The old boarding house on the outskirts of town had been abandoned for years. Once a grand estate, it had fallen into decay, its walls covered in ivy, its windows long shattered by time and neglect. Most people avoided it, claiming it was haunted, but to Ethan, it was the perfect place to stay. He had just moved to town for work, and housing was expensive. When he found an ad for cheap room for rent, he didn't think twice. The landlord, an old man with a distant gaze, barely spoke as he handed over the key. "This house is old," the landlord muttered. "Strange things happen. Do not go into the room at the end of the hall." Ethan had laughed it off. He wasn't superstitious, and as far as he was concerned, the only thing scary about the house was its creaky floorboards and outdated plumbing. His room was small but comfortable, with a single bed, a wooden desk, and a wardrobe that smelled faintly of mothballs. The first night was uneventful, save for the wind howling through the broken windows in the hallway. But on the second night, Ethan heard something strange. A soft creaking sound, like footsteps, coming from the hallway. At first, he thought it was the landlord, but when he peeked out, the corridor was empty. Then he noticed something strange, the door at the end of the hall. It hadn't been there before. Ethan frowned. He could have sworn the hallway ended in a wall, but now there was a door. An old wooden door, slightly ajar. A faint whispering drifted from inside. Ethan's stomach twisted. The landlord's warning echoed in his mind. "Do not go into that room." He stepped closer, hesitant. The whispers continued, low and urgent, like several voices speaking at once. His hand hovered over the doorknob, his breath unsteady. Then the door slammed shut. The force of it sent a gust of cold air rushing down the hall, making the candle he had left, burning in his room, flicker violently. Ethan's pulse pounded. He backed away, shutting his own door and locking it. He told himself it was just the wind, that the house was old and full of strange noises. but deep down something in his gut told him he was wrong. That night he barely slept. The next day, Ethan tried to shake off the unease. He spent the morning at work, keeping himself busy. By the time he returned to the house, he had almost convinced himself nothing had happened. But then he saw it. The door at the end of the hall, wide opened. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The room beyond was dark, the air around it unnaturally still. Then he noticed the footprints. Faint, wet footprints leading from the doorway to his room. His hands trembled as he unlocked his door and stepped inside. His room was exactly as he left it, except for one thing. The wardrobe. It was opened. Ethan's breath hitched. He had never left it open. Slowly, he stepped forward, peering inside. Nothing, just his clothes hanging still in the dim light. But then, something moved in the mirror on the wardrobe door. Ethan froze. His reflection stood perfectly still, but behind him, a shadowy figure loomed in the mirror. Tall, hollow-eyed, grinning. The lights flickered. Ethan whirled around. Nothing was there. His chest rose and fell in shaky breaths as he backed away from the mirror. He slammed the wardrobe shut, forcing himself to breathe. Then a whisper. "You let me in." The room went cold. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices filling the air. Ethan bolted out of the room, his heartbeat deafening in his ears. The hallway was darker than before, the walls seeming closer, like they were shifting. And at the end of the hall, the door stood wide open. Inside, the darkness seemed alive. Then he saw them. Figures moving inside the room, shapes shifting in the shadows, their eyes glowing light. Dying embers. They were watching him. Then the door began to close. Not slamming this time. Slowly. Deliberately. Ethan knew if it shut, he wouldn't be able to leave. He ran. His feet pounded against the wooden floor as the whispers rose to screams. He reached the staircase, almost stumbling as he rushed down. The landlord was at the bottom, standing in the dim glow of a lantern. "You opened it," the old man said, his voice hollow with resignation. Ethan gasped for air. I didn't, I just..." The house shook. The old man's expression darkened. Now they're free. Behind him, the door at the end of the hall creaked open again. The landlord turned, his face pale. "Run." The front door burst open on its own, and Ethan didn't hesitate. He sprinted into the night. The voices chasing him, whispers slithering through the wind. When he finally dared to look back, the house was gone. Nothing remained but an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. No building, no lights, no landlord. Only the darkness. And the whisper right behind his ear. "We found you." The old well had been in the center of the village for as long as anyone could remember. The elders warned children to stay away, claiming it was cursed. It was covered now, its stone walls cracked, its wooden lid warped with age, but people still heard whispers coming from inside it at night. Amina never believed in such stories. She was a journalist visiting the village to write about its fatting traditions. The well was just a piece of history to her, nothing more. Until she heard the voice. It was late past midnight when she stepped outside her guest house for some air. The village was silent, the houses dark. A cold wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a faint sound, a whisper. Her heart skipped a beat. It was coming from the well. She moved closer, the sound growing clearer. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a child's voice. "Help me." Amina's breath hitched. She scanned the area, no one was around. The village was asleep. She hesitated before stepping closer. Who's there? Silence. She swallowed hard and reached out, pressing her ear against the wooden lid. "Please help me." A chill ran down her spine. It was definitely coming from inside. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the lid, pushing it aside just enough to peek in. Darkness inside the well seemed endless, a void swallowing the light from her phone's flashlight. The damp air carried the scent of mold and something else, something rotting. And then, a hand shot up from the darkness. Amina stumbled back, barely suppressing a scream. The hand was small, like a child's, its skin, pale and dripping with black water. It clawed at the edge of the well, struggling to pull itself out. She should have run. Every instinct told her to run. But she didn't. She grabbed a nearby rope, tying it to the wooden post beside the well. Her breath was ragged. As she lowered herself inside, the air grew colder the deeper she went. The walls were slick with moisture, and the smell was overwhelming. The whispers continued, echoing around her. "Help me, please." Her feet finally touched the bottom, sinking slightly into the muddy ground. Her flashlight beam swept across the darkness and landed on a girl. She was no older than 10, her long black hair dripping wet, her white dress stained with filth. She stood in the corner, her back turned to Amina. "Are you okay?" Amina whispered, her voice shaking. The girl twitched. Amina took a slow step forward. "It's all right. I'll get you out of here." The girl's head snapped to the side, too far, too fast. Amina's blood ran cold. The girl's face was twisted in a grotesque grin, her eyes black pits of emptiness. The whispers turned to screams. The rope snapped, and the darkness swallowed her whole. The next morning, the villagers found the well open. Amina was gone. But that night, when the wind howled through the village, the whispers came again. "Help me." And this time, there was a second voice. The rain poured relentlessly as James Holloway drove through the winding mountain roads, his headlights barely piercing the thick mist that clung to the trees. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as his GPS signal flickered in and out. He had been driving for hours, searching for a place to stop for the night. When he finally spotted the dimly lit sign on the side of the road, he exhaled in relief. A Blackwood Inn vacancy. The building stood tall against the darkness, its old brick exterior covered in creeping ivy. The warm glow from the windows made it look almost inviting, but something about it felt off. James pushed the thought aside. He was exhausted, and sleep was his only priority. Pulling into the empty parking lot, he grabbed his bag and hurried inside. The lobby was eerily quiet, furnished with dark wooden chairs, and a front desk that looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. A large antique clock on the wall ticked loudly, the only sound breaking the silence. A man emerged from the back room, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken as if he hadn't slept in days. His name tag read Mr. Whitmore. "Welcome," the man said, his voice flat. "You'll be in room 306. James hesitated. I didn't even tell you my name." Mr. Whitmore slid the key across the desk without answering. The uneasy feeling returned, but James shook it off and took the key. He climbed the grand staircase, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. The walls were lined with old portraits, their subjects staring blankly into the void. When he reached room 306, the door creaked as he pushed it open. The room was immaculate, the bed freshly made, the furniture polished. But there was something strange. The mirror across from the bed was covered with a sheet. James frowned. Why would a hotel cover a mirror? He reached for the sheet but hesitated. Cold chill crawled up his spine, and for some reason he couldn't bring himself to pull it down. Shaking his head, he changed into fresh clothes and collapsed onto the bed, too tired to dwell on the odd atmosphere. He turned off the lamp, letting the darkness settle. But then he heard it. A faint knocking sound. It was coming from inside the room. James sat up, his pulse quickening. His eyes darted around, scanning the shadows. Knocking came again, this time louder. Then the sound changed. It was no longer knocking. It was scratching. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind the covered mirror. James swallowed hard, his hands clenching the sheets. His gut told him not to look, but his curiosity got the better of him. He stood and walked toward the mirror, each step feeling heavier than the last. He reached out, grasping the sheet. Then the scratching stopped. The room fell deathly silent. He pulled the sheet away in one swift motion, and his blood ran cold. His reflection was wrong. It stood in the mirror, mimicking his every move, but the eyes were hollow, dark voids, stretched where his pupils should have been. The reflection's lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile. James staggered back, his breath coming in short gasps. Then his reflection stepped forward. Out of the mirrors. James screamed. He turned, scrambling for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lights flickered violently as the air grew thick with whispers. "You shouldn't have come here." The reflection moved closer, its movements unnatural, its limbs too long. James pounded on the door. "Help, somebody." No answer. The mirror James was only inches away now, its head tilting at an impossible angle. Its voice came out in a slow, distorted whisper. "Stay with us." The lights went out. James felt cold fingers wrap around his throat. Then nothing. The next morning, the hotel was empty. There was no Mr. Whitmore, no room 306. The front desk was covered in dust, as if no one had used it for years. And in the grand hallway mirror, if you looked closely, you could see James. Still trapped, still screaming, still trying to leave. The rain was relentless, hammering against the windshield as Clara Dalton drove through the narrow, winding roads that cut through the vast countryside. The storm had rolled in fast, and visibility was almost non-existent. Her phone had lost signal miles ago, leaving her with nothing but the sound of the rain and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. She had been on her way to visit her grandmother's house, but somewhere along the drive, she must have taken a wrong turn. The road ahead was unfamiliar, lined with thick trees that seemed to close in the further she drove. The headlights barely cut through the swirling mist, rising from the wet pavement. Then through the rain, she saw it. A house standing alone on the side of the road. Clara let out a breath of relief. Maybe she could ask for directions, or at the very least, wait out. The storm inside. It was an old Victorian mansion, its dark exterior barely visible against the night. Sky, the windows were dark, save for one dimly glowing light on the upper floor. She pulled into the muddy driveway, cutting the engine. The house stood eerily still, almost like it was waiting. She shook off the unease creeping up her spine, grabbed her coat, and stepped out into the rain. As she approached the front door, she noticed something odd. The door was already open. Not fully, just slightly ajar, as if someone had been expecting her. She hesitated. Everything inside her screamed to turn around and leave, but the rain was pouring and she had nowhere else to go. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and decay. The grand foyer stretched before her, lined with antique furniture covered in white sheets. A large chandelier hung above, its crystals coated in cobwebs. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing through the house. No answer. She moved further inside, her footsteps creaking against the old wooden floor. The house felt too quiet, as if it had been frozen in time. Then she heard it. A faint whisper. She froze, her breath hitching. It came from upstairs. Clara turned toward the grand staircase, her heartbeat thudding against her ribs. The single glowing light on the upper floor flickered slightly, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Then footsteps. Soft, deliberate, coming from the room with the light. Her stomach twisted. She wasn't alone. Taking slow, careful steps, she ascended the staircase. The air grew colder with every step, and an overwhelming sense of wrongness settled over her. As she reached the top, the door to the lit room swung open. A bedroom, untouched as if someone had been living there recently. A large antique mirror stood in the corner, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. The light flickered again, casting long, warped shadows. Then she saw something move in the mirror. A shape. Not hers. Something else. Something tall and twisted, standing in the shadows just beyond the reflection. A cold wave of terror crashed over her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Her breathing turned shallow. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but as she turned toward the door, it slammed shut. Clara jumped back, her pulse hammering. She reached for the doorknob, twisting it frantically. But it wouldn't budge. Then behind her, the whispering started again. Closer this time. Right behind her. She turned slowly, her hands trembling. The mirror, the reflection had changed. She was still there, but behind her, a pair of hands were reaching out. Long, pale fingers crawling toward her shoulders. A breath cold as ice brushed against the back of her neck. Then a voice. "You shouldn't have come." The lights flickered violently. A shadow lunged from the mirror. The room collapsed into darkness. Clara screamed. The next morning, the storm had cleared. A passing driver spotted her car, abandoned in the driveway of the old, empty house. The front door stood wide open. But Clara was gone. Inside, everything was covered in dust, as if no one had stepped foot inside for decades. And in the antique mirror, if you looked closely, you could see something. A figure standing in the shadows, watching, waiting for the next visitor. Ethan loved books. He had read every book in his small town's library, so when his parents moved into an old house with a dusty attic full of forgotten books, he felt like he had discovered a hidden treasure. The house was quiet and smelled of old wood and paper. The attic had a single window, covered in dust. Boxes were stacked high and cobwebs hung in the corners. But what excited Ethan the most was the old wooden bookshelf against the far wall. It was filled with leather-bound books, their titles faded. One book stood out. It had no title on the spine, just a dark red cover. When Ethan pulled it from the shelf, a whisper filled the room. Finally, Ethan froze. He looked around. The attic was empty. The wind outside was still. Maybe he had imagined it. He opened the book. The pages were yellowed and full of handwritten notes. Strange symbols covered the margins. Some words were crossed out. At the bottom of the first page, he found his name, Robert Holloway. That night, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the book. Who was Robert Holloway? Why did the book feel so important? He placed it on his bedside table and fell asleep. A soft whisper woke him. Ethan. He sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark. The book lay closed beside him. The whisper came again. Ethan, the attic. Ethan shivered. The voice was low, almost a breath. It came from above. He looked at the ceiling. The attic door was closed. Gathering his courage, he climbed out of bed and grabbed his flashlight. Slowly, he made his way up the stairs. The attic door creaked as he pushed it open. Moonlight filtered through the dusty window, casting long shadows. Everything looked the same except for the bookshelf. The red book was missing. Ethan felt his skin prickle. He was sure he had left it in his room. He turned, ready to leave, but then he saw it. The book sat open on the old wooden table in the center of the attic. A single sentence was written across the page. Find me. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer. The attic suddenly felt colder. The air was heavy, like the silence before a storm. He reached out, his fingers brushing the page. The whisper returned. Below the floor. Ethan stepped back. The floor, he aimed his flashlight down. The wooden boards were old and uneven. He knelt and knocked on them. One board sounded hollow. Heart racing, he pulled at it. It was loose. With a quiet creak, he lifted it. Underneath was a small, dusty box. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a photograph. A man stood in front of the same bookshelf, holding the red book. His eyes were dark, his expression unreadable. On the back of the photo, a message was scrawled in faded ink. Robert Holloway, the book must stay hidden. Ethan's hands trembled. He looked at the bookshelf at the place where the red book had been. The whisper came one last time. Leave it, close the book. Ethan snapped the book shut. The attic seemed to breathe, the air growing warmer. He placed the book back on the shelf, exactly where he found it. As he stepped away, the whisper faded. Ethan never opened the red book again, but sometimes, late at night when the house was silent, he thought he heard a voice in the attic. Soft. Waiting. Break time equals 25, 5/. Lena's grandmother had lived in the old house by the lake for as long as she could remember. But after she passed away, the house sat empty for months. When Lena's family decided to visit and clean it, she felt both excited and uneasy. The house was small. with creaky wooden floors and lace curtains that fluttered even when the windows were closed. The lake behind it was still and quiet, reflecting the moon at night like a giant mirrors. Lena's room was on the second floor. It had a large window that overlooked the lake. She loved that view as a child, but now something about it made her stomach twist. The first night as she lay in bed, she had the strange feeling that someone was watching her. She turned to the window. A shadow stood at the edge of the lake. Her breath caught. It wasn't moving, just standing there. As she blinked, it was gone. The next morning, Lena convinced herself it had been a trick of the moonlight. She spent the day dusting furniture and packing up old clothes. By the evening, she had almost forgotten about the shadow. Almost. That night she woke up again. The room was cold, too cold. The window was open. But she didn't remember opening it. Her heart pounded as she sat up. Outside, the lake shimmered in the moonlight. And the shadow was there again. Closer this time. It stood halfway between the lake and the house. Lena's fingers gripped the blanket. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, the shadow took a step forward. Lena gasped and scrambled for the bedside lamp. The light flickered on. She looked back at the window. The shadow was gone, but the window latch was unlocked. The third night, Lena decided to close the curtains before bed. She told herself she wouldn't. Look, if she didn't look, nothing could scare her. But at midnight, a soft tap woke her. Tap, 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 against the window glass. Lena's breath shook. She didn't want to look. She had to. Slowly, she turned her head. The curtains were closed, but behind them, she saw the shape of a figure. Tall, motionless, waiting. The tapping came again. Lena reached for the lamp with trembling fingers. Light flooded the room. She threw open the curtains. Nothing. Only the lake, still and silent under the night sky. Lena locked the window. This time she checked it twice. In the morning, she found footprints in the dirt outside, leading from the lake, stopping right under her window. She and her family left that afternoon. They never went back. But sometimes, Lena dreams of the shadow standing by the lake, watching, waiting. And in those dreams, the window is always open. Break time equals 25, 5/. David loved driving at night. The empty roads, the cool air, and the soft hum of the engine always made him feel calm. That's why he didn't mind taking the long route home after visiting a friend in the countryside. The road stretched through miles of dark forest with no street lights and no signs of life. It was just him, his car, and the endless trees. An hour into the drive, his headlights caught something on the side of the road. A figure stood, just beyond the trees, barely visible in the shadows. David's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. As he passed, he caught a glimpse of a pale face, but before he could focus, the figure was gone. Probably just a hitchhiker, he thought, or maybe his tired mind playing tricks on him. He kept driving, shaking off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. But then, in his rear view mirror, he saw something strange. The back seat, which had been empty, now had a shadow shape, a figure sitting perfectly still. His hands turned cold. He didn't want to look, but his eyes flickered to the mirror again. The figure was there. A woman with long, dark hair, her face turned away. David's pulse pounded in his ears. His mind screamed at him to stop the car, to run, to do anything but sit there frozen. Slowly, with shaking hands, he adjusted the mirror. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, maybe. The woman moved. Not much, just the slightest tilt of her head. Not towards the window, not towards the road. Towards him. David's breath caught. His foot pressed harder on the accelerator. The trees blurred past, the car speeding through the empty road. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to look at the mirror. Again, the silence in the car felt heavier now, like someone was breathing just behind him. Then a whisper, low, soft, right by his ear. "Why didn't you stop?" David slammed the brakes. His body jerked forward, heart hammering in his chest. The car skidded to a stop in the middle of the road. Panting, he turned around. The back seat was empty. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. He forced himself to take deep breaths. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe the long drive was making him see things. He let out a shaky laugh and rubbed his face. He just needed to get home. He put the car in gear and glanced in the mirror one last time. The woman was there. Closer. Smiling. Break time equals 25, 5/. When Mia moved into her new apartment, she felt lucky. It was cheap, quiet, and close to her. Job, the building was old but well-maintained, with long hallways and wooden floors that creaked underfoot. Everything seemed normal until she noticed something strange about the doors. Her apartment was number 306, but the numbers skipped from 305 to 307 in the hallway. There was no 306. The hallway had no door leading to her apartment, yet inside everything was fine. A bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen, just like any other place. She told herself it was nothing, just a weird numbering mistake. But at night, she started hearing noises. Soft knocks on the wall, slow, shuffling footsteps in the hallway. She checked the peephole, but the corridor was always empty. Once, she heard a door creak open, but when she looked, no. Doors had moved. Then one night, she woke up freezing. The air in her apartment felt heavy, like someone was there with her. She turned on the lamp and gasped. Her closet door was open. She never left it. Opened. Mia grabbed her phone and used its flashlight to look inside. Nothing, just clothes and old boxes, but as she turned to go back to bed, she noticed something in the corner, a faint outline. A door. Her heart pounded. There had never been a door there before. It was built into the wall with no handle, just an old keyhole. She stepped closer, every instinct telling her to stop. She placed her ear against the wood. A whisper. "Let me in." Mia stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. She grabbed her keys and ran out of the apartment. The hallway was empty and silent. No missing door, no sign of anything wrong. The next morning, she called the landlord. She tried to stay calm as she asked, "Was there ever another room connected to my apartment?" The landlord was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. "Not anymore." Mia didn't ask anything else. She packed her bags and left the apartment that same day. She didn't care about breaking the lease. She never went back. But sometimes, she wonders what would have happened if she had opened that door. And sometimes, she still hears the whisper. "Let me in." Break time equals 25, 5/. Emily had always been warned never to go near the woods behind her grandmother's house. The trees were too thick, the paths too easy to lose, and the silence too unnatural. But one afternoon, while playing outside, she saw something strange just at the edge of the trees. Small porcelain doll, sitting perfectly upright on a fallen log. It was old, with cracked white skin and faded blue eyes. Its dress was torn and dirty, but it had been placed there, not dropped or lost. Emily glanced back at the house. Her grandmother was inside, and no one else was around. Something about the doll made her uneasy, but curiosity pulled her forward. She picked it up. That night, the scratching started. At first, it was soft, like tree branches against the window, but there were no trees close enough to reach. Then it became clearer, tiny, sharp sounds coming from inside her closet. Emily pulled the blanket over her head, her heart hammering. The sound went on for hours. In the morning, she found the doll sitting on her bedside table. She didn't remember bringing it inside. Her hands shook as she grabbed it and ran downstairs. "Grandma," she said, holding out the doll, "where did this come from?" Her grandmother's face went pale. She grabbed the doll and wrapped it in an old cloth, stuffing it into a wooden box. "You didn't bring this into the house, did you?" she asked, voice tight. Emily swallowed. I found it outside." Her grandmother nodded, locking the box with shaking fingers. "It's not yours," she whispered. "It belongs to the woods." That night, Emily barely slept. She kept hearing things, the scratching, the whispers. But in the morning, the doll was gone. The wooden box sat open. The front door was unlocked. And outside, leading back into the trees, were small footprints. Not Emily's. Something else. Something that had come back for what was theirs. Break time equals 25, 5/. James had always been a heavy sleeper. No matter how noisy the world around him got, he would sink into unconsciousness the moment his head hit the pillow. But after moving into his new apartment, his sleep was not as peaceful as it used to be. The first night, he woke up to the sound of whispering, soft, hushed voices that seemed to drift through the walls. He sat up, heart pounding, but the room was empty, thinking it was just his imagination. He lay back down. But the whispers continued every night. They weren't coming from outside or the hallway. They were inside the walls. James tried everything, playing white noise, wearing earplugs, even rearranging his furniture, but nothing stopped the voices. Then one night, the whispers turned into something worse. A scratching sound, like nails dragging across the wooden beams inside the walls. The sound moved along the perimeter of his bedroom, creeping closer and closer to his bed. James clenched his blanket, sweat beading on his forehead. The scratching grew louder, more desperate, like something was trying to claw its way out. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. James barely had time to breathe before he heard the whisper, this time clearer than ever. "Let me out." James bolted upright. His body trembled as he reached for his phone to turn on the flashlight. He shined it at the wall beside his bed. Nothing, just old, cracked wallpaper. Then he saw it. A faint bulge in the wall, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. His breath hitched, the bulge pulsed, like a hand pushing against the surface. The wall cracked. With a horrifying groan, the plaster crumbled, revealing a dark cavity. Inside, something moved. A skeletal hand reached out, its bony fingers twitching, stretching toward him. James screamed. The whispers turned into wails. The thing inside the wall pushed harder, the hole growing wider. James scrambled out of bed, knocking over his lamp in the process. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he was frozen in place as the thing dragged itself out. A face, hollow and twisted, peered at him through the crumbling wall. Its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You finally heard me." The last thing James saw before the darkness consumed him was the creature lunging forward, its cold fingers closing around his throat. Mark was exhausted. The long drive through the countryside had left him drained, and the only thing he wanted was to reach the motel, get a few hours of sleep, and continue his journey in the morning. The road stretched endlessly before him, flanked by dense, whispering trees that seemed to shift in the moonlight. His eyelids grew heavy, and he turned up the radio to keep himself awake. Then he saw her, a woman in a white dress, standing by the side of the road, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders. Her pale face was partially hidden by the darkness, but her eyes shone unnaturally bright. Mark's heart skipped a beat. A lone woman on a deserted highway at this hour. He hesitated before pulling over. "Need a ride?" he called out through the open window. She nodded silently and slid into the back seat without a word. Mark swallowed. Something about her presence made the air in the car feel colder. He glanced at the rearview mirror, but she was staring straight ahead, unmoving. He drove. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind against the car. Then, in a barely audible whisper, she said, You should drive faster." Mark frowned. "What?" "He's following us." His blood ran cold. He gripped the wheel tighter, his pulse quickening. He checked the mirrors, but the road behind them was empty. No headlights, no movement, nothing. "You okay back there?" he asked cautiously. No response. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at her in the mirror, but she was gone. Mark slammed the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. He whipped around. His back seat was completely empty. The passenger door hadn't opened. There was no sign of her anywhere. A chill ran down his spine. Then a whisper right next to his ear. "He's still following you." The breath on his neck was ice cold. Mark didn't scream. He didn't even turn around. He slammed his foot on the gas, racing through the darkness, knowing that whatever had gotten into his car that night wasn't human. And something far worse was still behind him. It started with a simple dream, a dream that felt too real. Lisa had always been a deep sleeper, but lately her dreams had become strange. Every night she found herself in the same place, a cold, dimly lit bedroom that was not hers. The air smelled of damp wood and something rotten. She would wake up in a small bed covered in old, moth-eaten blankets. The walls around her were scratched, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. And every night she heard the voice, "Don't wake up." At first she assumed it was just a recurring nightmare, but soon reality began to blur. She would wake up from the dream only to find strange marks on her arms, as if she had been dragging herself through something rough. Her sheets smelled of mildew, and sometimes she would wake up gasping for breath, as if she had been drowning. The worst part, every time she closed her eyes, she returned to that same room. One night, Lisa decided to fight back. In the dream, she forced herself to get out of bed, her feet hitting the freezing wooden floor. A single door stood at the far end of the room, barely hanging. On its rusted hinges, she approached it cautiously, her breath hitching as she reached for the handle. The whispers started again. "Don't wake up." Lisa hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her to listen, to lie back down and never touch that door, but she had to know. With a deep breath, she yanked the door open. Darkness, a long, endless hallway stretched before her, the walls pulsing like they were alive. The air was thick, suffocating, and somewhere in the distance, footsteps echoed. They were coming closer. She turned to run back into the room, only to find the bed gone. The walls were shifting, closing. The whispers turned into screams. "You shouldn't have woken UP." Lisa's eyes shot open, her body drenched in sweat. She gasped, clutching her chest, relieved to find herself back in her own room. But something was wrong. The air smelled of damp wood. Her sheets were covered in scratches. And the bedroom door, the one she had never touched, was slightly open. From the darkness beyond, something whispered, "Go back to sleep." "You said." Ethan had never been afraid of the dark. As a child, he had slept soundly through storms, ignored creaky floors, and dismissed the imaginary monsters under his bed. But that changed. The night he first saw him, it started subtly. Every night before bed, Ethan had a habit of glancing around his room, checking the door, the window, and the closet before falling asleep. One night, as he did his usual check, he noticed something different. In the farthest corner of his room, near the dresser, the shadows seemed darker than usual. Tall, thin shapes stood there, blending into the darkness. Ethan blinked, rubbed his eyes, and turned on the lamp. Nothing was there. Shrugging it off as exhaustion, he turned off the light and settled in. But as soon as his eyes adjusted to the dark, the shape was back. A man, tall, motionless, watching. Ethan's body went stiff. His breaths became shallow. He wanted to convince himself that his mind was playing tricks on him, but something about the way the figure stood, completely still, unblinking, made his skin crawl. He reached for the lamp again. His fingers fumbled for the switch, and as soon as light filled the room, the corner was empty. This happened every night. No matter how many times he turned on the light, the man was gone. But as soon as darkness reclaimed the room, the figure returned. And each night it seemed to move just a little closer. One night, Ethan decided to test it. He pretended to sleep, half-lidded eyes barely open, watching the dark corner. Hours passed. The room remained still, then movement. The figure stepped forward. Slow, deliberate. Ethan's heart pounded against his ribs. The figure was no longer just a shadow, he could see. More details now. Hollowed-out eyes, an unnaturally stretched smile, skin too pale to be human. It stood at the foot of his bed now, leaning forward, grinning. A voice, hollow and rasping, whispered, "You see me now." Ethan didn't scream. He couldn't. His body refused to move. The figure reached out, fingers stretching toward his face. The lamp. With every ounce of willpower, Ethan lunged for the switch. Bright light flooded the room. Nothing. His heart pounded in his ears as he gasped for breath. The next night, Ethan didn't turn off the light. And he never did again. But as the days passed, he noticed something worse. Even in the light, even in the brightness of day, the man in the corner never left. Mia had always been a light sleeper. The smallest creak of the house would stir her awake. The faintest shift in the wind rattling against her window would send chills down her spine. But nothing had ever terrified her more than the thing that breathed. It started on a Wednesday night. She had just drifted into sleep when she heard it. A long, drawn-out breath, slow, raspy, deliberate. Inhale, exhale. Mia's eyes snapped open. Her room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through her curtains. She strained her ears, trying to figure out if the sound had come from inside her head, but then, inhale, exhale. It was coming from the foot of her bed. Her blood turned to ice. She gripped the blanket tightly, her fingers trembling. She dared not move, not even to breathe. Too loudly in case whatever was there noticed her. Slowly, carefully, she peeked over the edge. Of the covers, nothing. Just the darkness, the soft hum of the night. Mia, you're imagining things. She forced herself to roll over, away from the sound. If she ignored it, maybe it would go away. Then she felt it. A breath against the back of her neck. Hot, rotten close. Mia leaped out of bed, flipping the lamp on in one frantic motion. The room flooded with light. Empty. Her door was still closed, her window still locked. She was alone. Trembling, she pulled the covers around herself and sat against the headboard, her eyes locked onto the empty space where the breathing had come from. It didn't happen again that night. But the next night it returned. Closer. She tried sleeping with the lights on, but the breathing didn't stop. It stayed right there, just past the reach of the light, always outside her line of sight. One night, in a moment of desperation, Mia grabbed her phone and hit the record button. She held her breath, letting the eerie silence take over the room. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, inhale, exhale. Tears stung her eyes. She wasn't imagining it. It was real. She played the recording back, expecting the worst. But the audio had only one sound. Her own breathing. Confused, she rewound the file, listening more carefully. Then she realized. The breathing had matched hers perfectly. At first, but toward the end, there was an extra breath. A breath that didn't belong to her. Mia didn't sleep that night. And when morning came, she packed her bags and never returned to that house again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she still hears it. Inhale, exhale, right behind her. The sleepless ones. Jason had always been able to sleep through anything. Thunderstorms, traffic, even the occasional earthquake. But for the past 2 weeks, he hadn't slept at all. It wasn't insomnia. He was exhausted, but something wouldn't let him sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt them watching. It started subtly, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, a whisper just out of reach. At first, he dismissed it as stress, overwork, or maybe just a bad case of paranoia. But then, the shadows in his room started to shift. They weren't just shadows anymore. The first time he really saw them, it was 3:04 a.m. He had just started to doze off when the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. His eyes fluttered open, and there, in the corner of his room, something moved. Not a trick of the light. Not his imagination. Something was there. Tall, slender, faceless. It didn't breathe, it didn't move, it just watched. Jason wanted to scream, but his throat locked up. He fumbled for his bedside lamp, his fingers. Trembling, the second the light flicked on. It was gone. Just the familiar four walls of his room. The next night, he forced himself to stay awake. He set up his phone to record, hopping to capture proof that he wasn't losing his mind. But when he checked the footage the next morning, all he saw was himself, tossing, turning, whispering in his sleep. "They're here." The words sent a chill down his spine. He had never spoken in his sleep before. By the fourth night, he could feel them even when he was awake, if he turned his head too. Quickly, he'd catch glimpses of them in the corners of mirrors, reflections of something that shouldn't exist. One night, he made the mistake of speaking to them. "What do you want?" he whispered into the darkness. For the first time, they moved. Slow, shuddering steps crawling closer from the shadows, a dozen of them surrounding his bed, their presence suffocating. A voice, hollow and ancient, whispered back, "We are the sleepless ones." Jason's body froze. "And now so are you." A wave of exhaustion slammed into him like a freight train. His eyes burned. His limbs felt like lead. His body screamed for sleep, but he knew what would happen if he closed his eyes. He would never wake up. That was 3 weeks ago. Jason doesn't sleep anymore. He can't. And if you ever feel like something is watching you from the corner of your room when the lights go out, whatever you do, don't fall asleep. The whispering sleeper. Emily had always been a quiet sleeper. No tossing, no mumbling, just deep, peaceful rest. But that changed the night she moved into her new apartment. It started with whispers. Not in the waking world, but in her sleep. Her roommate, Claire, was the first to notice. One night, Claire shook Emily awake, her face pale, her hands trembling. "You were talking in your sleep," Claire whispered. Emily rubbed her eyes. "So, people do that all the time." Claire shook her head. "No, you weren't just talking. You were whispering in someone else's voice." That sent a chill through Emily, but she laughed it off, blaming stress, lack of sleep, anything but the creeping dread in her stomach. The next night, the whispers came again. Claire recorded them. When Emily listened the next morning, her stomach churned. It wasn't just mumbling, it was even in her voice. It was multiple voices, speaking in different tones, overlapping in a chilling, unintelligible conversation. Some voices were deep, guttural, others were soft, almost weeping. And one was right next to the microphone. "She's listening now." Emily dropped the phone. From that night on, the whispers grew worse. She started waking up with scratches on her arms, bruises on her legs. One morning, she found dirt under her fingernails, though she hadn't left her bed. She set up a camera, desperate for answers. The next morning, she watched the footage with shaking hands. At first, she was just lying still, breathing softly. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., her body sat up. Her eyes were still closed. Her mouth moved, whispering, muttering, her voice shifting between different tones. And then, she turned, slowly, deliberately. Her head twisted toward the camera, though her eyes were still shut. And she smiled. Emily slammed the laptop shut. She didn't sleep the next night, or the night after that. But the whispering didn't stop. It didn't come from her anymore. It came from the walls, from the closet, from right next to her bed. Go to sleep, Emily. She hasn't slept since. And neither should you. The thing under the sheets. Noah always slept with his feet tucked under the covers. It was a childhood habit, a silly fear he had never fully outgrown. His mother used to tell him, nothing can get you if you stay under the blankets. That belief comforted him until the night it betrayed him. It started with a tug, a small, gentle pull at the edge of his sheets. Half asleep, he groggily reached down and yanked them back up, assuming he had just kicked them off. Then it happened again. This time it was stronger. His pulse quickened. He forced his eyes open, staring at the darkness around him. The room was silent, the door was shut. Then, a slow, deliberate movement. Something slithered beneath the sheets. Right by his feet. Noah froze, his breath hitched in his throat. His mind screamed at him to throw the covers off, to run, but his body refused to move. The thing beneath the sheets pressed against his legs, the pressure creeping up toward his knees. It was solid, heavy, real. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Slowly, he reached for his phone on the nightstand. He didn't dare lift the sheets, but he could shine the light, see what was under there. His fingers barely brushed the phone when the pressure stopped. The weight lifted. The silence was suffocating. Then, the sheets moved. Not from his own breath, not from his own shifting. They moved as if someone, was crawling up from the foot of his bed, inching toward his chest. Noah squeezed his eyes shut, holding his breath. The weight pressed against his stomach now. Then his ribs. Then it stopped, right at his face. The room was dead silent. The air was freezing. He could feel it now, hovering just inches above him, hidden beneath the thin layer of fabric. A slow, raspy breath. Not his own. Noah couldn't take it anymore. He ripped the covers off in one frantic motion. Nothing. His bed was empty, his door still closed. But as he sat there, gasping, shaking, his blanket lying in a heap beside him, he realized something. The sheets were still moving. Something had stayed inside. And then, they collapsed, like something had just slithered out. Noah didn't sleep the rest of the night. And the next evening, when he finally worked up the courage to crawl back into bed, he made sure to keep the blankets tight around him. But just before he drifted off, a voice right beside his ear whispered, "Let me back in." The wrong side of the bed. Oliver never cared much for superstitions. He walked under ladders, spilled salt without tossing it over his shoulder, and had broken more mirrors than he could count. So when he heard the old wives' tale about always getting out of bed on the same side you got in, he laughed it off. Until the night he forgot. It was a cold Thursday evening when Oliver flopped into bed, exhausted from work. He crawled in on the right side, as he always did, pulling the blankets up to his chin. The familiar comfort of his mattress embraced him, and within minutes he was fast asleep. But when he woke up, something was different. At first it was subtle. The air felt heavier. The room was dimmer than it should have been, even. With the blinds shut, his body ached in places it never had before. He rubbed his eyes and swung his legs over the edge. The left side. Oliver hesitated. He didn't remember shifting positions in the night, but his groggy mind brushed it off, sleepwalking maybe. Then he looked around. His room was the same. The furniture was in place, his phone still on the nightstand. But something was off. The colors seemed wrong. The whites of his walls had a dull, grayish tint. His posters, familiar images he had seen every day, were slightly distorted, as if they were melting at the edges. Even the air smelled different. Thick and metallic like rust. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach. He grabbed his phone and turned it on. The screen lit up, but the time was missing. The battery bar was full, yet the percentage read percent. His notifications were garbled text, symbols that didn't make sense. And then a new notification popped up. You got out on the wrong side. Oliver's breath caught in his throat. He turned toward the door, heart pounding. He needed to get out of here. He stepped forward, only to realize the floor felt wrong. It was softer, not like carpet, not like wood. Like flesh. The walls, too, had begun to pulse. The posters on his wall melted completely, turning into long black streaks that oozed down to the floor. His reflection in the mirror was grinning. But Oliver wasn't. The grin widened. A whisper coming from everywhere at once. Get back in the right way. Oliver turned, scrambling back toward his bed. The blankets were no longer blankets, but a shifting, writhing mass of something that reached for him with fingers made of fabric. He didn't care. He dove in. The moment his head hit the pillow, darkness, silence, then sunlight. Oliver gasped, sitting up. His heart thundered as he looked around. His room was back to normal. The walls were white. The posters were intact. The floor was solid. His phone displayed the correct time. It had worked. Shakily, he swung his legs over the edge of the bed. The right side. He let out a breath of relief. Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe he had just imagined it. But just as he was about to stand up, his phone vibrated. A single notification. Next time you won't wake up. The shadow that sleeps. Lena had always been a heavy sleeper. No dreams, no tossing and turning, just pure, uninterrupted rest. But after moving into her new apartment, her sleep became something else. Entirely. It started with the shadow. One night, as she lay in bed, she noticed something odd. The dim glow from her bedside lamp cast shadows across the room, but one of them didn't seem right. It was standing in the corner. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, the way her furniture distorted in the darkness. But as she watched, the shadow moved. Not a flicker, not a shift. It leaned forward. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She scrambled for her lamp, flicking it off and on again. When the room lit up, the shadow was gone. She barely slept that night. The next evening, she convinced herself it had been exhaustion, a hallucination brought on by stress. She left the lamp on as she curled up under the covers. At exactly 3:14 a.m., she woke up. The room was silent, but the air felt wrong, thicker, like something was waiting. Slowly, she turned her head toward the corner. The shadow was there. Closer this time. She held her breath, her body frozen in fear. Then, the shadow crawled. It slithered up the wall, its shape twisting, shifting, stretching toward the ceiling. A deep rattling. Breath filled the room, though Lena didn't know if it was coming from the thing or from her own. Just then, before she could move, the shadow dropped from the ceiling, right onto her bed. Lena screamed and threw herself out of bed, scrambling for the light switch. The second the room lit up. Nothing. No shadow, no sound. Just her racing heartbeat. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. But the worst part, when she checked her phone the next morning, she found a picture in her gallery. A grainy, dark photo of her, asleep in bed. And right above her, a shadowed figure, smiling. Danny had always been a quiet sleeper, never snoring, never shifting much, just resting peacefully through the night. That changed when he moved into his new apartment. The first night as he drifted off, he thought he heard something, soft, muffled breathing, not his own. He sat up listening, but the room was silent. Brushing it off as his imagination, he lay back down and closed his eyes. The second night, the breathing returned, only this time it was closer. It wasn't the steady rhythm of someone sleeping. It was erratic, as if someone was standing over him, struggling to hold back their breath. His body tensed, but when he opened his eyes, the room was empty. The door was shut, the window locked, yet the air around him felt heavy, thick with something unseen. By the third night, Danny was convinced something was wrong. He set up his phone to record, while he slept, hopping to catch whatever was making the sound. The next morning, he hesitated before checking the footage. The first few hours were normal, just him tossing slightly, nothing unusual. But then at exactly 3:07 a.m., the blanket shifted. Not a little, not from his movement, but as if something was pulling it. Then came the whisper, "You're finally listening." Danny's blood ran cold. He rewound the video, hands shaking, and listened again. The whisper wasn't his voice. It wasn't even close. He scanned the footage frame by frame, but there was nothing there. Yet as the whisper spoke, the blanket depressed, as if unseen fingers were pressing into it. He didn't sleep the next night. He couldn't. But as he lay in the dark, his eyes wide open, his mind racing, he realized something terrifying. The whisper wasn't coming from the recording anymore. It was coming from right next to his ear. The voices beneath the floor. It started with a whisper. At first, Amelia Thatcher thought it was her imagination, just the creaks and groans of an old house settling into the night. The cottage she had inherited from her estranged grandfather was nearly a century old. Its wooden floors warped with time, its walls thick with the scent of aged timber and dust. It was secluded, tucked away in a small forest, clearing miles from the nearest town. She had come here to escape the noise of city life, hopping. The solitude would give her the peace she desperately needed. But on her third night in the house, she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper drifting from beneath the floorboards. At first, she dismissed it, telling herself it was just the wind slipping through cracks in the foundation. But as the nights passed, the whispers grew louder. They were not the wind. Lying in bed, her eyes wide open in the suffocating darkness, she could hear them more clearly. Now murmuring voices speaking in hushed, frantic tones. Sometimes they spoke in a language she didn't understand. Other times they whispered her name. The fourth night was the worst. She had barely slept, her body tense, every sound amplified by the crushing silence around her. At 3:12 a.m., she heard something move beneath her bed. Slow, deliberate scraping sound, not mice, not the house settling, something alive. Heart hammering, she reached for the flashlight on her nightstand and flicked it on. She took a deep breath, leaned over the edge of the bed, and shined the beam beneath. The space under. The bed was empty, except for the floorboards, one of which had been pushed slightly upward. Her pulse skipped. She hadn't noticed that before. She hesitated, then reached down and pressed against the loose board. It wobbled under her. Touch, lifting slightly, as if something beneath it had pushed up from the other side. Then the whisper came again, directly beneath her. "Let me out." Amelia screamed, jerking back and scrambling onto the bed. The floorboards rattled as if something was shifting below, pushing against the wood. For the rest of the night, she didn't move. She sat curled in the center of the bed, clutching the flashlight, listening. The whispers continued, rising and falling in intensity, and then, just before dawn, they stopped. By morning, she convinced herself it had to be her imagination. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But the loose floorboard haunted her thoughts. She had to see what was underneath. With trembling hands, she grabbed a crowbar from the tool shed and returned to her bedroom. She knelt beside the bed, heart pounding in her ears, and slipped the edge of the crowbar. Beneath the board, with a deep breath, she pried it up. The board popped loose, revealing a dark, empty crawl space beneath the house. The air that rushed out was cold, stale, carrying the scent of damp earth. She leaned forward, shining her flashlight into the space. At first, she saw nothing but dirt and cobwebs. Then she saw the hand. A withered gray hand, its fingers long and bony, pressed against the underside of the remaining floorboards. Her breath caught. The fingers twitched. Then came the whisper. "You shouldn't have done that." The hand moved fast. Before she could react, the floorboards split apart as if something was tearing through them. From below, Amelia staggered back, dropping the flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor, casting long, shifting shadows as a figure began to rise from the darkness beneath the house. It was wrong. Twisted, emaciated, its limbs too long, its eyes black hollow, its mouth stretched into a grin that shouldn't have been possible. Amelia turned and ran. She didn't stop to grab her keys, didn't stop to look back. She just ran out of the house into the cold morning air, her screams swallowed by the thick silence of the forest. When she finally dared to stop, heart hammering, she turned to look back at the house. The front door was wide open, and in the doorway, the figure stood watching her, smiling. She never went back. Weeks later, when authorities arrived to investigate the abandoned property, they found the house empty, but the floorboards in the bedroom had been ripped apart. The crawl space beneath was deeper than it should have been, extending into a tunnel that stretched into the darkness, further than any foundation should go. No one knows where it leads. But sometimes, late at night, people passing through the forest say they hear whispers rising from the ground, calling for help, begging to be let out. Myra had always been a deep sleeper, but lately she had been waking up feeling exhausted, as if she hadn't slept at all. It wasn't nightmares or restlessness, just a growing sense of unease. that something was off. One night, as she prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the mirror and hesitated. She had seen herself in the mirror countless times before, but tonight, something felt different. The reflection looked normal at first glance, but as she turned away, she swore it lingered a moment longer than it should have. Shaking off the ridiculous thought, she crawled into bed, leaving the mirror facing her from across the room. Sleep came quickly, but so did the dreams, dark, shifting images of someone standing over her watching. She woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, and instinctively looked toward the mirror. Her reflection was sitting up. She was frozen in place. She forced herself to blink, and when she looked again, her reflection was lying down, mirroring her position perfectly. Her heart pounded as she convinced herself she had imagined it. But every night after that, the dreams got worse, and every morning she felt more drained, more disconnected, like something was slowly pulling her away from herself. One night, desperate for answers, she left her phone camera recording while she slept. Next morning, she hesitated before pressing play. The footage showed her lying still, undisturbed until exactly 3:33 a.m. That was when the reflection moved. It sat up, staring directly into the camera, though Myra herself hadn't moved an inch. Then, slowly, the reflection smiled. The real Myra remained motionless, but the figure in the mirror leaned closer, pressing its hands against the glass. And then, horrifyingly, it climbed out. The screen cut to static. Myra's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at the mirror across the room, dread seizing her chest. The reflection was gone, but she was still in bed. The door that wasn't there. The night was colder than usual when Mark Evans arrived at his new apartment. It was an old building built in the early 1900s and had been recently renovated. He had found the place online at an unbelievably low price, and although it seemed too good to be true, he didn't ask too many questions. He just needed a place to stay. The landlord, a quiet old man with deep wrinkles and sunken eyes, handed him the keys. Without much conversation, "It's all yours now," he said, "but a word of advice, don't open the door at the end of the hall." Mark chuckled, thinking it was a joke, but the landlord's face remained serious. "The building's old. The door doesn't lead anywhere. It's been sealed for decades," the man added. Mark nodded, shaking off the odd warning as he grabbed his keys. It was probably just an old maintenance closet, nothing to worry about. That night, as he unpacked, he noticed how quiet the building was. He hadn't seen any neighbors, no sounds of footsteps in the hall, no distant murmur of TVs or conversations. Just silence. At around midnight, as he was lying in bed scrolling through his phone, he heard it. A knock. Slow, deliberate. It came from the end of the hall. Mark sat up, heart thudding in his chest. It had to be his imagination. But then the knock came. Again. 3 loud, heavy knocks. He hesitated, debating whether to check it out. Maybe the landlord had forgotten something. Maybe it was a neighbor, but something about it felt wrong. Curiosity got the better of him. He stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the single overhead bulb flickering as if struggling to stay alive. The hall stretched forward, narrow and eerie in the dim light. At the very end stood the door, the one the landlord had told him not to open. The knocking had stopped. He stared at the door. It was old, wooden, slightly warped with age. There was no doorknob, just a keyhole. A cold chill ran through him as he stepped closer. He pressed his ear against the wood, listening. At first, silence. Then a whisper. It was faint, almost too soft to hear. "Let me out." Mark staggered back, his breathing uneven. His mind raced with explanations. Maybe it was an echo from another apartment. Maybe someone was playing a prank. Then he heard it again. "Let me out." But this time, it came from inside his apartment. He spun around, his pulse hammering in his ears. His apartment door was wide open, even, though he was sure he had locked it. The room beyond was dark, the air thick with something he couldn't explain. The whisper came again, closer this time. Mark ran. He rushed into his apartment, slamming the door behind him, locking it, his chest heaving. He stood there, heart racing, waiting. The silence. Minutes passed. Maybe it had just been his imagination. Maybe he was just tired. Then the doorknob twisted. Not the door at the end of the hall. His door. Mark stumbled back, staring at the knob as it slowly turned, rattling as if someone was trying to get in. Then from the other side came the whisper. "You looked through the keyhole, didn't you?" Mark's blood ran cold. He hadn't looked through the keyhole, but something wanted him to. The whispering grew louder, the voice shifting, warping, turning into something inhuman. Then silence. Mark stood frozen in place for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. The doorknob never moved again. By morning, he packed his bags and left. When he told the landlord he was moving out, the old man nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting it. "You heard it, didn't you?" Mark didn't answer, but as he drove away, he glanced back at the building one last time. And in the window of his apartment, he saw it. A dark figure standing there, watching, waiting for the next tenant, the sleeper's guest. Ryan had lived alone for years, and he liked it that way. His apartment was small but comfortable, his nights peaceful and undisturbed. That was until he started waking up with the distinct feeling that someone had been in his room while he slept. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia, too many horror movies before bed, an overactive imagination. But then he started noticing small things out of place. The closet door, which he always kept shut, would be slightly ajar in the morning. His phone would be on the floor instead of the nightstand. The covers would be pulled just a little too tight around him, as if someone had tucked him in. One night, determined to put his fears to rest, he set up his laptop to record him while he slept. The next morning, his stomach churned as he pressed play. The first few hours were normal, him tossing a little, the rise and fall of his breathing. But at 2:59 a.m., the footage changed. The blanket at the foot of the bed moved slightly, as if an unseen hand had brushed over it. Then slowly, Ryan's sleeping body shifted, not by his own doing. It was as if something had lifted him just slightly before settling him back down. His breath hitched when he saw the next part. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the closet door creaked open. A dark shape, tall, thin, with elongated limbs, crawled out, moving with an unnatural stillness. It stood beside his bed, watching him for what felt like an eternity before bending down, inches from his face. Ryan wanted to look away, but he forced himself to keep watching. The figure didn't just stand there, it leaned over him and whispered something into his ear. His sleeping body responded, Ryan could see his lips moving, though no sound came from the video. He was having a conversation while unconscious. The figure tilted its head, seemingly amused, before slowly slithering back into the closet, closing the door behind it. The footage ended. Ryan's hands trembled as he touched his ear. It was ice cold. He turned toward his closet, dreading what he already knew. The door was open, just a crack. And from the darkness inside, something whispered, "You said I could stay." The man in the cornfield. The highway was empty, stretching endlessly under the pale glow of the full moon. Daniel. Reed had been driving for hours, the hum of the car engine the only sound breaking the eerie silence of the night. The GPS had stopped working miles ago and his phone had lost signal. He was alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless rows of towering cornfields on either side of the road. The air inside the car was stale, thick with unease. He hadn't seen a single house, gas station, or passing car in what felt like hours. Just endless stalks of corn swaying gently in the warm summer breeze. His stomach twisted. He had a bad feeling one he couldn't shake. Then he saw him. A man standing in the middle of the road. Daniel's foot slammed the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a sudden halt. His breath hitched as his headlights illuminated the figure ahead. The man was tall and thin, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were old, tattered, covered in dirt. He didn't move. He just stood there facing the car, watching. Daniel's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. His instincts screamed at him to turn around. Something was wrong. Then, as if sensing his hesitation, the man tilted his head. Slowly, too slowly. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Then the headlights flickered. For a split second, the road ahead was empty. The man was gone. Daniel's pulse pounded. He scanned the road, his hands trembling, but there was no sign of him. Then came the knocking. Slow, deliberate. Right on his driver's side window. Daniel's body went rigid. His chest tightened, cold fear wrapping around his ribs like a vice. He didn't want to look. He couldn't. But his eyes betrayed him. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his head toward the window. The man was right there, face inches from the glass. Except he had no face. Where his features should have been was just a smooth, featureless expanse of skin, stretching unnaturally over bone. Daniel let out a strangled gasp, his foot slamming on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires spinning against the pavement as he sped away, the cornfields blurring past him. His hands shook violently on the wheel, his mind racing. It was impossible. But when he dared to glance at his rearview mirror, the man was standing in the road behind him, unmoving, watching. The further Daniel drove, the more frantic he became. His knuckles were white against the wheel, his breath ragged. He just needed to find a way out of here. Then up ahead he saw it, a gas station. Relief surged through him. He swerved into the parking lot, barely pulling the car to a stop, before stumbling out, his legs shaky beneath him. The station was old, run down, but it was something. The lights flickered above the pumps, and the place seemed deserted. Still, Daniel rushed. Inside, the bell above the door jingling sharply. An elderly man stood behind the counter, watching him with sunken eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son," the old man muttered. Daniel tried to catch his breath. There was a man on the road he had known. The old man's expression darkened. His gaze flickered toward the window. "You need to leave." Daniel frowned. "What, You need to leave, now." A sudden, chilling silence settled over the room. The fluorescent lights buzzed, flickering. Daniel followed the old man's gaze toward the window. His blood ran cold. The man in the hat was standing just outside the gas station. Watching. Waiting. The old man's face was pale, his hands gripping the counter. He doesn't like when they stop. Daniel took a step back. "What are you talking about?" The old man swallowed hard. His voice was barely a whisper. "You should have kept driving." Then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the station. The bell above the door jingled. Daniel turned, but the door never opened. Then a breath. Right behind him. Daniel never made it out of the gas station. The next morning, his car was found parked outside, the engine still running. But Daniel was gone. The only clue left behind was a single dusty footprint on the gas station floor. And the man in the hat, still standing in the middle of the road, waiting for the next traveler. The sleeper's echo. Samantha had always been a heavy sleeper, the kind who could drift into unconsciousness within minutes and wake up feeling completely refreshed. That was until the night she heard herself speaking in her sleep. At first, she thought nothing of it. People talk in their sleep all the time, but the more it happened, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just mumbling or incoherent sounds. She was having conversations. She only became aware of it when her roommate, Lily, shook her awake one night, her face pale. "You were talking," Lily whispered, glancing nervously at Samantha's side of the room. "But it wasn't your voice." That sent chills down Samantha's spine. She tried to laugh it off, but Lily refused to sleep in the same room after that. Curious and unnerved, Samantha decided to record herself while she slept. The next morning, she hesitated before pressing play. The first few hours were normal, soft breathing, occasional movement, but then at 3:27 a.m. something changed. Her sleeping self sat up. The motion was slow, deliberate, unnatural. Then, in a voice that was unmistakably hers but filled with something else, she spoke. "Where are you?" A long silence followed. Then, from the darkness of the room, another voice answered. "I'm here." Samantha's sleeping body nodded, as if in understanding, then whispered something inaudible. The voice responded again, this time closer. "Soon we will be the same." The recording ended abruptly. Samantha's blood ran cold. She turned to look at her bed, at the pillows and blankets she had just woken up from. Everything looked the same except for one thing. The indentation on the other side of the bed, as if someone else had been lying there. And when she exhaled, she heard something horrifying. An echo, her own breath repeating itself, coming from right behind her. Marcus had never been afraid of sleeping. In fact, he loved it, the escape, the dreams, the quiet solitude of the night. But that changed when he started waking up to messages he did remember sending. It began with small things, a text to a friend that he had no memory of. Typing, a browser history filled with searches like how to recognize sleepwalking and can. Someone control their body while asleep. At first, he assumed he was just groggy, half-conscious when he did those things. But then the messages changed. One morning, he woke up to a text he had sent to himself at 3:44. The message was short. "Are you awake?" His stomach tightened. He didn't remember typing that. He didn't even remember waking up. Confused, he set up his phone to record himself while he slept. The next morning, the footage chilled him to the bone. For the first few hours, he lay still, breathing softly, unmoving. Then at 3:44 a.m., his body sat. Up, his head turned toward the camera, but his eyes remained closed. Slowly, he reached for his phone and typed something. Then with eerie calmness, he smiled. The footage ended there. Marcus checked his phone. The sent message was still there. "Are you awake?" But there was something new, a reply. A message he hadn't seen before. One that hadn't been there the night before. "Yes, but you're not." The forgotten room. When Oliver Wade first moved into the Willowcrest apartments, he thought he had found a perfect place. The rent was cheap, the neighborhood was quiet, and his one-bedroom unit on. The third floor was more than enough for him. The building was old, its halls lined with faded wallpaper and flickering light bulbs, but he didn't mind. The landlord, an elderly man with sunken eyes and a tired voice, handed him the keys without. Much conversation, but before Oliver left the office, the old man hesitated. "One rule," he muttered, "don't go into the door at the end of the hallway on your floor." Oliver raised an eyebrow. "Why?" The landlord's gaze darkened. "It doesn't exist." That made no sense. Oliver chuckled awkwardly, assuming it was just some quirk of an eccentric old man, and shrugged it off. He moved in later that evening, unpacking his things and settling in. But that night, as he lay in bed, he noticed something strange. The hallway was too long. He had walked it earlier, counted the doors. There should have been 5 apartments on the third floor, but now, as he stared from his doorway, there were 6. At the very end, where there should have been a wall, there was a door. Oliver's stomach twisted. He could have sworn it wasn't there before. The door was different. From the others, older, its dark wood chipped and cracked. There was no number on it. Then came the knocking. Soft, rhythmic, coming from inside. Oliver's skin crawled. His mind raced, trying to find an explanation. Maybe it was just another apartment he hadn't noticed. Maybe it was a storage closet. The knocking came again. Then a whisper. "Let me out." His breath caught in his throat. The voice was wrong, layered, as if more than one person was speaking at once. Oliver backed into his apartment, slamming his door shut and locking it. He climbed into bed, pulling the covers over himself like a child hiding from a nightmare. By morning, he told himself it had been a bad dream. But the door was still there. And that night, the knocking started again. Days passed, and Oliver tried to ignore it. But the knocking continued, every night, always at exactly 3:00 a.m. The whispers grew. Clearer, more insistent. "Please let me out. I just need to get out. Don't you hear them?" Sleep became impossible. Dark circles formed under his eyes. Every time he passed the hallway, the door seemed closer, as if the building itself was shifting. Then, on the 6th night, he made a mistake. He looked through the keyhole. At first, all he saw was darkness. The apartment beyond was pitch black. Then something moved. A pale eye, bloodshot and unblinking, stared back at him. Oliver jerked away, heart hammering, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. His hands trembled as he backed into his apartment and locked the door. Then a whisper, "And now I see you too." The knocking grew violent. A thud, then another. The door shook as something pounded from the inside. Oliver pressed his hands over his ears, rocking back and forth as the whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural, inhuman. Then suddenly, silence. Morning came, but Oliver couldn't bring himself to leave his apartment. When he finally dared to check the hallway, his stomach twisted in horror. The door was open. The darkness inside was endless, stretching into an abyss that swallowed all light. And in the center of the threshold, there was a footprint. A wet, muddy footprint, as if something had stepped out. That night, Oliver packed his bags. He needed to leave. But when he reached his front door, his doorknob wouldn't turn. The lock was gone. Then he heard it. The knocking. But this time, it came from inside his apartment. The next morning, the landlord found Oliver's apartment empty. His belongings were still. There, his bed unmade, his keys on the kitchen counter. But Oliver was gone. And at the end of the hallway, the door had disappeared. The landlord sighed, shaking his head as he turned away. The building always took one when someone got too curious. And soon it would be hungry again. The sleeper in the mirror. Nina had always slept with a mirror in her room. It was just part of the decor, an antique piece she had inherited from her grandmother. It stood tall against the far wall, reflecting her bed, her window, and the soft glow of her nightlight. She never thought much about it until the night she woke up facing it. At first, she thought nothing of it. Maybe she had rolled over in her sleep, but the next night it happened again, and the next. Each time she would wake up staring into the mirror, her reflection barely visible in the dim light. Something about it made her skin crawl. Determined to put her paranoia to rest, she set up her phone to record herself sleeping. Next morning, she hesitated before watching. For the first few hours, nothing happened. She lay still, breathing evenly. Then, at exactly 3:11 a.m., she sat up. But something was wrong. Her movements were slow, unnatural, almost puppet-like. She turned her head toward the mirror, her eyes still closed. Then, in a way that made Nina's stomach turn, she smiled. But that wasn't the worst part. Because at 3:12 a.m., her reflection didn't move with her. It stayed lying down. Nina felt ice in her veins as she watched herself, her real self, rise from the bed while her reflection remained motionless, frozen in place. She turned toward the mirror in the video, tilting her head slightly, examining the still figure inside the glass. Then her recorded self whispered something so soft the phone barely picked it up. "You took too long." Then slowly, the reflection sat up. But it moved wrong, not like Nina, not like a person. The reflection jerked upright, its head tilting at an impossible angle. And then, it grinned wider than a human should be able to. The screen cut to static. Nina dropped her phone, her pulse racing. Her breathing was ragged as she forced herself to turn toward the mirror in real life. She was still lying in bed, but her reflection was already standing. The town that doesn't exist. The road stretched endlessly ahead, cutting through an ocean of dark trees. A leaner west had Been driving for nearly 5 hours, her phone's GPS having lost signal an hour ago. She had followed the signs toward the nearest town, but every mile she drove, the deeper her unease grew. The world outside her windshield felt too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then through the misty darkness, she finally saw it, a town. A faded wooden sign stood at the entrance, barely illuminated by her headlights. Welcome to Ravenshire, established 1892. She let out a sigh of relief. She wasn't lost after all. As she drove through the main street, something felt off. The town was old with cobblestone, roads and buildings that looked frozen in time. Gas lamps flickered dimly along the sidewalks, casting long, shifting shadows, but there were no people. No cars, no movement. Only silence. Elena pulled into a gas station, but as she stepped out, she noticed the pumps were rusted, covered in vines as if they hadn't been used in decades. A shiver ran down her spine. She walked toward the small convenience store attached to the station, the bell above the door jingling softly as she stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and something faintly rotten. The shelves were stocked with faded, outdated products, cans of food with labels from the 1960s, newspapers so yellowed with age they crumbled at the edges. Then she saw the cashier, an old man sitting perfectly still behind the counter. His skin was pale, his eyes too wide, his thin lips stretched into a frozen smile. "Welcome," he said, his voice dry and brittle like old paper. Elena swallowed hard. Hi, I think I'm lost. My phone's dead and I was hopping to..." "You're not lost," the old man interrupted. Her stomach twisted. There was something wrong with him. She forced a nervous smile. "Right, well, I just need directions to the nearest highway." The man's unblinking eyes stared at her. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then he finally spoke. "There is no highway." Elena frowned. "What do you mean? I came in from the road." "There is no road." A chill crawled up her spine. She turned toward the door, her pulse quickening. The street outside was different. Where there had once been an empty road, there were now people. They stood on the sidewalks, perfectly still, facing the store. Their clothes were old-fashioned, faded with time. Their faces were expressionless, eyes hollow, their mouths slightly open as if frozen in mid-speech. Elena's breath caught in her throat. They hadn't been there before. She turned back to the old man, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I should go." The old man's smile widened. "But you just got here." The bell above the door jingled. Elena whipped around. A woman now stood in the doorway, blocking her exit. Her skin was gray, her eyes sunken, and her lips were curled into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. Elena bolted for the back exit. She crashed through the rear door and into a narrow alley, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The street ahead was twisting, warping like a mirage. The buildings seemed closer then. Before, their windows filled with shadowy figures. Then the whispers began. Soft at first like a breeze, but soon they surrounded her. "Stay with us. You belong here now." She ran. Her feet pounded against the cobblestone as the town around her shifted, the streets stretching, twisting into a maze that shouldn't exist. No matter how far she ran, she always ended up back where she started, in front of the gas station. The people were still there, still watching, still smiling. The old man stepped outside, his movements slow and unnatural, his head tilting too far to one side. "You can't leave," he murmured. Alina screamed. She turned to run again, but the town was gone. Everything had disappeared. She was standing in the middle of the forest, her car nowhere in sight. The gas station, the buildings, the people, all vanished. But the whispers remained, soft right behind her. She turned, her body trembling. And there, standing among the trees, watching her with hollow smiles, were the people of Ravenshire, waiting for her to come back. The house that waits. The rain poured in thick sheets as David Miller drove down the winding back roads of Hollow. Creak, his wipers struggling to keep up with the relentless downpour. His phone had died in. Hour ago, and the last sign of civilization had disappeared miles back. The gas gauge hovered, near empty, and the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. Then he saw it. A house. It stood alone at the end of a narrow dirt road, nestled between towering trees that swayed violently in the storm. The old Victorian-style mansion looked out of place, its structure eerily intact despite its obvious age. The windows were dark, lifeless, yet David couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from inside. His stomach twisted. He didn't want to stop, but he had no choice. The rain was too heavy, the gas too low. He pulled into the overgrown driveway, killing the engine as lightning illuminated the sky for a brief second. The front door was open. A chill crawled up his spine. He hesitated, staring at the gaping entrance. He hadn't seen anyone outside who had opened it. David shook off the unease and grabbed his flashlight. It was just an old house, probably abandoned. The door had likely blown open from the wind. Stepping inside, he was greeted by dust and silence. The grand foyer stretched before him, lined with antique furniture covered in white sheets. The chandelier above swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. "Hello," he called out. His voice echoed, swallowed by the emptiness. No response. His boots creaked against the wooden floor as he ventured deeper. The house smelled of aged wood and something faintly metallic. Dust floated through the dim air, disturbed by his movements. Then footsteps. Not his. Upstairs. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. He listened. Silence. It must have been the house settling, he told himself, but his skin prickled his instincts, screaming that he wasn't alone. He stepped toward the staircase, shining his flashlight upward. The second-floor hallway stretched into darkness, lined with closed doors. Then he noticed it. One of the doors was slightly ajar. The light inside flickered. Someone was there. His pulse thundered in his ears. He wanted to turn back to leave, but his feet moved forward, on their own. The closer he got, the colder the air became. His breath misted in front of him. Then, just as he reached the door, it slammed shut. David jumped back, his heart hammering. The sound echoed through the house, followed by an eerie silence. His flashlight flickered. Then the whispering began. Soft, layered voices murmuring from behind the door. David's blood ran cold. He turned, ready to flee, but the hallway was different. The floor stretched longer than before, the walls warping, the shadows growing deeper. The house was changing. The whispers grew louder. "Don't leave. Stay with us." Then, from the door behind him, a knock. Slow, deliberate. David clenched his fists, forcing himself to turn. The door stood still, but something moved. Beneath it, a shadow. It stretched unnaturally, seeping under the doorframe like a living thing. Then a hand slid through. Pale, too long, too thin. David stumbled back, a strangled breath escaping his lips. The hand twitched, fingers curling, as if beckoning him closer. Then the voice returned. "You're already inside." The lights went out. Darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, David's car was found outside the mansion. The driver's seat was empty. The keys still in the ignition. But inside the house, there was no trace of him. Just dust-covered furniture and a single, newly closed door on the second floor. Waiting for the next visitor. The room that wasn't there. The apartment building at the corner of Rosewood and Ninth had been standing for nearly a century, its walls soaked with the memories of countless tenants. Ethan Cole had never believed in ghost stories, but when he moved into apartment 405, something about the place felt off. It wasn't the creaking floors or the flickering hallway lights. Those were expected in an old building. It was something else. Something wrong. His first night was quiet, save for the usual city noises. But on the second night just passed. Midnight, he heard it. A door closing. Not from another apartment, from inside his own. His stomach twisted as he sat up in bed, ears straining in the darkness. He was alone, he had checked every door before sleeping. His heart pounded as he stepped into the hallway, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Then he saw it. A door at the end of the hallway. It hadn't been there before. His breath hitched. He had walked through this apartment at least a dozen times before moving. In, there was no extra door. But there it was. Old wooden, slightly ajar. A thin sliver of darkness seeped through the crack, as if the space beyond didn't belong to this world. A strange humming sound drifted from within, low and rhythmic, almost like whispering. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to leave, but curiosity pulled him forward. He reached for the knob. His fingers barely grazed the cold metal when the door slammed shut. A burst of air rushed past him, making the hallway light flicker. His breath came in short, uneven. Gasps, the whispering stopped. Silence. He staggered back, his chest tightening. This wasn't real, it couldn't be. He turned on every light in his apartment, packing until exhaustion took over. By the time he collapsed into bed, the first hints of dawn painted the sky. The next morning, the door was gone. The wall was smooth, seamless, as if it had never been there. For days, Ethan convinced himself he had imagined it. Stress, fatigue, his mind playing tricks on him, but at night the whispers returned. And every night the door came back. Each time it was a little more open. By the fifth night, it was open just wide enough to see inside. He told himself not to look, but he did. The room beyond was wrong. Not empty, not dark, just wrong. It stretched too far, the walls curving in unnatural ways. The furniture inside was identical to his own, arranged exactly the same, but something was off. The colors were duller, the air thicker, and a faint, sour smell of decay drifted out. Then he saw it. A figure, standing in the far corner, still watching. It was him. A perfect copy. Except it was. Its eyes were hollow, its smile too wide. Ethan slammed the door shut, his hands trembling. He pushed his dresser against it, his pulse hammering so loud he could barely think. But then a knock, soft, rhythmic, from the other side. Then came the whisper, "Let me in." Ethan backed away, shaking his head. The knocking grew louder. The whispers overlapped, voices merging into something inhuman. The lights flickered violently, the walls shuddering as if the whole apartment was coming. Then suddenly, everything stopped. He waited, his chest heaving. The room was silent. Slowly, he moved forward, heart pounding as he placed his hand against the door. Nothing. Then he blinked. The door was gone. The next morning, Ethan packed his bags. He didn't care about breaking his lease, he just needed to leave. As he rushed out, the landlord, an old man with tired eyes, watched him from behind the front desk. "You saw it, didn't you?" the old man murmured. Ethan froze. The landlord sighed, shaking his head. It happens sometimes. Ethan's mouth was dry. What happens? The landlord held his gaze. It tries to find a way in. Ethan swallowed hard, his hands clammy. Did anyone else? The old man simply shook his head. Ethan didn't ask any more questions. He turned and left the building, vowing never to return. But as he walked past the front windows, he caught a glimpse of his reflection. And for just a second, his reflection didn't move. It just smiled. The call that shouldn't have come. The night was quiet, too quiet for a city like this. Claire Matthews sat alone in her apartment, the dim glow of her laptop screen illuminating the otherwise dark living room. The rain tapped against the window, rhythmic and unsettling, as she tried to focus on her work. Then at exactly 2:37 a.m., her phone rang. The sudden noise made her jump, her heart racing as she reached for it. Unknown number. Well, she hesitated. Nobody called her this late. She let it ring, waiting for it to go to voicemail. But it didn't stop. Even after the usual number of rings, it kept going. A cold unease crawled over her skin. With a deep breath, she finally picked up. "Hello." Silence. For a few seconds, she thought it was a prank call. Then she heard breathing. Slow, shallow. Then a whisper. "Claire." Her blood ran cold. The voice was hers. Every muscle in her body tensed. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The line crackled, distorting the breathing. Then laughter. Not normal laughter, something warped, too deep, too layered. Her chest tightened. "I'm hanging up." "Don't." The voice was closer now. Then the call dropped. Claire sat frozen, the phone still pressed against her ear. Her apartment suddenly felt too big, too empty. She checked the call log. There was no record of the call. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, swallowing the lump in her throat. Then her phone lit up again. Another unknown number. She grabbed it, her pulse hammering, but before she could react, her laptop screen flickered. The document she had been working on was gone, replaced with a single sentence. "Let me in." Claire's breath hitched. She shut the laptop, her fingers clammy against the keyboard. Then the knocking started. Soft, rhythmic, from inside her apartment. Her heart lurched. That was impossible. She was alone. She grabbed her phone and backed toward the hallway. The knocking continued, deliberate and slow. Her mind raced. Was someone inside? How? Then her phone vibrated violently in her hand. A text message. "Unknown number. Check your closet." Claire's stomach twisted. She glanced at the hallway, at the door to her bedroom closet, standing slightly ajar. The knocking had stopped. A heavy silence filled the room. Her breathing was shaky as she stepped forward, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she didn't. She reached the closet door, her fingers trembling as she grasped the handle. She pulled it open. Nothing. Just darkness, the usual clutter. She let out a shaky breath. Maybe this was some kind of elaborate hack or prank. Maybe. Then she noticed it. Her clothes were wrong. They were the same clothes she owned, but different. They were backward, flipped as if they had been placed in a mirror version of her closet. Then she saw the shoes. A pair of dirty, wet footprints leading from the closet to right behind her. The lights flickered. The whisper came again. "Claire." She spun around. The last thing she saw was herself, smiling. The next morning, Claire's apartment was empty. Her laptop sat open on the desk, the screen displaying one message. "I let myself in." The phone sat beside it, still unlocked. The last call in the log was 2:37 a.m. The call had lasted forever. The passenger who wasn't there, asterisk. The subway station was nearly empty asterisk. The flickering fluorescent lights casting long, distorted shadows across the tiled floor. Jake Morgan checked his watch. 11:49 p.m., the last train of the night would arrive soon, and he was desperate to get home. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself as a cold breeze swept through the underground platform. It was strange. There shouldn't have been a draft this deep underground. A low voice crackled over the intercom. "Next train arriving in 1 minute. Stand clear of the platform edge." Jake sighed and glanced around. Only 3 other passengers stood waiting. A man in a business suit, a woman reading a book, and a tall figure in the corner standing too still. The train's distant rumbling grew louder. The lights above flickered again. Jake shifted on his feet, stealing a glance at the tall figure Something about them made his skin crawl. They were dressed in dark clothes, their hood pulled low over their face. They did move. The train's headlights pierced the tunnel darkness. Jake looked back toward the rails, and froze. The tall figure was now standing beside him. His breath caught. He hadn't seen them move. The train screeched to a halt, its doors hissing open. Without hesitation, Jake stepped inside, moving to an empty seat near the door. The train was nearly deserted. The businessman and the woman sat near the front, but the tall figure had followed him inside. They took a seat directly across from him. Jake's fingers tightened around his phone. Don't look, just focus on the ride home. The train lurched forward, diving into the darkness of the tunnel. For a few moments, everything was quiet, save for the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks. Then **A whisper. You're going the wrong way. Jake's stomach dropped. The voice was *low**, distorted as if it was coming from everywhere at once. Slowly, he looked up. The tall figure was **gone. His heart pounded. He scanned the nearly empty train, but the figure had vanished. Then the lights flickered. For half a second, he saw them. Sitting next to him. Their hood had fallen back, revealing a face that wasn't human. A wide, unnatural grin stretched across their face, their hollow black eyes locked onto his. Then the lights came back on. The seat was empty. Jake staggered to his feet, his breath ragged. The train car felt different now, the air heavier. Then the intercom crackled. This is the last stop. Jake frowned. That wasn't right. He had at least *6 more stops before his station. The train shuddered to a halt, its doors sliding open. Beyond them, only darkness. No platform, no station, just an endless empty void. Then the whispers returned. You shouldn't have boarded. Jake's chest tightened. He turned toward the businessman and the woman, but they weren't moving. Their faces were wrong now. Their eyes were wide, their mouths stretched into unnatural smiles. Jake stumbled back, shaking his head. Then a hand grabbed his wrist. Ice cold, too strong. He whipped around. The tall figure was there again, their face inches from his. You're staying. The lights went out. The next morning, the subway ran as usual. But Jake Morgan never got off the train. His seat was empty, his phone left behind on the floor. And at exactly *11:49 p.m. every night, the last train still runs through that same tunnel. Passengers say that if you sit near the doors, you might feel someone watching you. And if you hear a whisper telling you you're going the wrong way, don't look up. The hotel room that didn't exist. The night was colder than usual when Evan Hayes checked into the Ridgeway Inn, a small, rundown hotel on the outskirts of town. He had been driving for hours and exhaustion weighed heavy on his bones. The neon vacancy sign flickered against the rain-soaked pavement as he pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, the scent of old carpet and cigarette smoke clinging to the air. Thin, tired-looking receptionist sat behind the counter, barely acknowledging him as he approached. I need a room for the night, Evan said, sliding his card across the desk. The receptionist didn't look up. She simply grabbed a key from the rack behind her and placed it in front of him. Room 306. Evan frowned. didn't even ask my name. The woman's expression didn't change. "You're the only guest tonight." A strange unease settled in his stomach, but he shrugged it off. He was too tired to care. The elevator ride to the third floor was slow, the lights flickering as the doors groaned open. The hallway stretched before him, lined with faded wallpaper and doors that all looked identical, except one. At the very end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. A dark, empty space visible through the crack. Evan shivered, an unexplainable dread creeping through him. He hurried to his own room, shoving the key into the lock and stepping inside. The room was standard: a bed, a desk, a TV that looked like it hadn't worked in years. The only odd thing was the mirror. It was large, covering nearly the entire wall opposite the bed. Its glass was too clean, too reflective, as if it had been polished just for him. He ignored it, dropping his bag onto the chair before collapsing onto the bed. Then the phone rang. He sat up confused. Who would be calling him? Slowly, he picked up the receiver. Silence. Then breathing. Low, raspy. A whisper followed. "You're in the wrong room." Evan slammed the phone down. His heart pounded in his chest, his mouth suddenly dry. He turned toward the door. Had the receptionist given him the wrong room? Then he saw it. The closet door was open. It had been closed when he walked in. His breath hitched. Slowly, he reached for his phone, turning on the flashlight and shining it toward the closet. Empty. Just a coat rack. His own reflection flickered in the mirror behind him. Then his reflection moved. But he hadn't. His entire body stiffened, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. The reflection smiled, a slow, unnatural grin stretching too wide. Evan whipped around. The room was empty. But when he looked back at the mirror, his reflection was still smiling. Then it stepped forward. The lights flickered violently. The air grew thick, heavy with something he couldn't name. The reflection pressed a hand against the glass. Then it knocked. Evan stumbled backward. His breaths came in short, panicked gasps. Then, from inside the closet, another knock. Slow, deliberate. His body refused to move. Then the whisper returned. "Let me out." The lights went out. The next morning, the Ridgeway Inn looked the same as always. The receptionist sat behind the counter, staring blankly at the lobby television. But room 306 was empty. The bed was untouched, the lights off. No luggage, no sign of anyone ever being there. No record of an Evan Hayes checking in. The only thing left behind was the mirror. And if you stood in front of it long enough, you might see something. A shadow standing just behind you, smiling, waiting for the next guest. The elevator that never stopped. It was almost midnight when Ryan Carter stepped into the elevator of his apartment building. The hallways were quiet, the air heavy with that stale, old building smell. He had just finished a late shift and was eager to get home, his mind already half asleep as he pressed the button for the 14th floor. The doors slid shut, and the elevator hummed softly as it ascended. Ryan leaned against the wall, rubbing his temples. Then the lights flickered. He frowned, glancing at the floor indicator. The numbers froze on 7 for a long moment before. The entire panel blinked off. A cold chill crawled down his spine. The elevator wasn't stopping. The soft hum of movement continued, but there was no floor number anymore. No buttons. Responded. The emergency stop switch did nothing. Then the elevator slowed. The doors opened. Ryan stepped forward. But this wasn't the 14th floor. The hallway beyond was wrong. The walls were too narrow, stretching upward into an unnatural darkness. The wallpaper was peeling, the light flickering overhead, casting shifting shadows. And at the far end of the hall, a single door stood slightly ajar. A faint whispering echoed from the other side. Ryan's breath hitched. Ryan's. The whisper was his own voice. His pulse thundered in his ears. He stepped back into the elevator, frantically pressing the buttons. The doors didn't close. Then a shadow moved at the end of the hallway. Something stepped into the light. Ryan's heart lurched. It was him. A perfect reflection of himself, standing motionless, its face blank, expressionless. Then it smiled. Not a normal smile. A slow, wide stretch of the lips, too far, too unnatural. The lights in the hallway flickered violently. The thing started walking toward the elevator. Ryan slammed the buttons. Come on, come on. The doors shuddered. The thing was closer now. Its neck tilted at an unnatural angle, its unblinking eyes locked onto his. Then the doors snapped shut. The elevator lurched downward. Ryan stumbled back, his breathing ragged, his skin clammy with fear. The floor indicator remained dark, the button still unresponsive. Then the whisper came again. Let me in. Ryan choked on a gasp. The voice was inside the elevator now. The lights went out. Darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, the elevator doors opened on the lobby floor. The security guard checked the surveillance footage, frowning at the screen. Ryan Carter had entered the elevator at midnight. But the doors never opened again. No one got off. No one was inside. The footage ended with the elevator doors opening to nothing. Yet every night at exactly midnight, the elevator still runs. And sometimes, if you're alone, you might hear breathing beside you. If you do, don't look.